we can say a lot of things about Donald Trump, but I do believe he did something that even those of us who think outside the box might have imagined was impossible.
I don't think we're going to vote the Fed out of existence, for instance.
Well, it's an interesting moment to say that, but we could obsolete the Fed out of existence.
How dark and bad is the idea of mandating people to do something that's against their bodily autonomy?
Pandemic
radicalized me on this front.
It throws people for a loop because they're thinking, oh, it's religion versus science. It's like, actually, no, religion is a technology.
If Dawkins were to recognize the error that he is making, that results in his own work being vastly more important than it is.
Public property is basically an oxymoron. There's no accountability mechanism built into that. But with private property, you do have this responsibility. If you don't take care of that asset, well, you're not going to have a thing to have rights to.
Well, I suspect I disagree with you here because
I'm very curious. We're kind of like, I guess, setting the frame for this long, meandering conversation we're about to have. But I am deeply curious about where incentives meet human evolution, right? Because this does seem to be the one area that we can actually engineer for ourselves and steer our evolution to some extent. And now incentives is a very broad term. I don't know, obviously there's things like linguistic relativity, right? The language you speak informs the thoughts you can create. We are the product of the 5 people we spend the most time with, the cultures you're engaged in enculturate you. There's all these processes of reciprocal reconstruction. What can I would just jump in here. If we have a corrupt system, that says something about us, obviously. And we need to, if we want to fix that, assuming we do we start inside of the human heart and mind, or do we start outside with the incentives? Do we do both? Like, where is this convergence between incentives and the extent to which we can drive our own evolution one direction or another?
I think the first thing we have to recognize is that we have run off the end of the tape of evolutionary processes. And it's hard to imagine a natural, gentle way back into a reasonable framework because we suffer from what Heather and I in our book call hypernovelty. Hypernovelty is the state at which the rate of change is so high that even though human beings are the fastest adapting creature that has ever existed, even our capacity to adapt is outstripped by the rate at which the environment changes on us. So the environment that you and I were born into, for example, no longer exists. We are adults in some environment that didn't exist when we were kids, which means that our developmental program did not prepare us properly for the world we live in. So that is a serious problem, and it's making us sick across essentially all domains and scales. We have to rein in that process or it will be our undoing. And reining in that process is not a simple matter. But what I think people do not properly understand because of the nature of modern life is that for an ancestor living in almost any of the environments that our ancestors lived in, life would be a great deal more intuitive because your perceptual apparatus would be properly calibrated for things that were actually valuable. What do I mean by valuable? I mean things that contribute to your evolutionary fitness.
Fitness payoffs.
Yes. Now, I have to point out, I do not subscribe to a standard definition of evolutionary fitness. I think this is one of the places that my field has fallen down. But if we understand that there is something that makes you evolutionarily better off over time, then you should be wired to have detectors when you're headed in a direction that seems to be enhancing it, and you should have other detectors for when you're headed in a direction where it's drying up, and then you should have some program that tells you actually ignore the signal that you're dropping in fitness because actually there's a peak that if you'll hold out long enough, you're going to attain a kind of fitness you couldn't get in the environment you came from. But our lives should be a great deal more intuitive than they are, and they are not, and that is forcing us to be what I would call conscious over decision-making that is not supposed to be conscious at all. Like what to put in your mouth. That's not supposed to be a difficult choice. Does it seem like something is desirable to eat? That's a good indicator you should eat it. Does it seem like something that's repulsive? Maybe that's a good indicator you shouldn't. And we can't even treat food that way anymore because lots of stuff has been built to trick us. You know, we have antagonists who want us to consume things that aren't good for us, and they may taste very good and be quite bad for you.
Wow. That is so true, right? The smart weapons of advertisers now have turned grocery store aisles into these target-rich environments that, I mean, I know, it's taken me a long time to learn through my own health journey what foods work and what foods don't, because it's not always just the thing that tastes good. That is good for you. So something you said there is really interesting to me, that you said you don't subscribe to, I think you said, the standard view of evolutionary biology as it pertains to natural selection.
To fitness.
Fitness, okay. Robert Pirsig said something in his book, Leela. I just want to hear your thoughts on it. He goes, the term survival of the fittest is reducible down to survival of the survivors. So it's basically kind of this tautology. And that seems like it makes fitness really hard to define if we say just survival of the fittest. So could you tell me a little bit about what your view of fitness, and if that view is wrong, and if so, why?
There is a major shift in the way you have to conceptualize things when you go from simple systems to complex systems, and then it happens again when you go from complex systems to complex adaptive systems. These things do not work the same way. And if you carry your simple system mindset where things can be complicated and you bring that into a truly complex system, you'll keep fumbling. One of the places that this has happened is in the tendency to want to instantiate a concept that is high quality so that we can go measure it and see if we understand it. So the instinct to take a concept like evolutionary fitness, which does have a tautology built into it, a tautology that doesn't bother me even a little bit.
Okay.
Right? We're trained, tautology is the indicator that you've done something wrong. But in this case, what we're really saying is there are characteristics that make you more likely to persist over time. And it makes logical sense that we would be wired to try to enhance those characteristics, which is, of course, true. So the fact that it's a tautology or a near tautology is not evidence that you've done something wrong. It's actually just saying the logic to the universe is consistent.
It's almost like the limitation of language in a way, right?
Well, it's the limitation of science.
Okay.
So it's great to know that there is something that we can describe as fitness. It's wonderful to want to go out into nature and look at it so you can see how it behaves. But the problem is you end up finding a proxy for it that's pretty good. So what we've done in evolutionary biology is we've found the proxy, which is reproductive success. On average, a creature that reproduces more is more fit than a creature that reproduces less, on average. So, 99 times in 100, if you go out and you measure reproductive success, you've seen something that's a pretty close match for fitness. And so you keep getting this reward, which is, we found it. Fitness is reproductive success. But then anytime fitness is not reproductive success, or fitness is the inverse of reproductive success, we're confused because we forgot that we took a robust concept that couldn't be instantiated, and then we took a proxy for it, which allowed us to measure it, but was imperfect. And
the map is not the territory, kind of thing.
The map is not the territory, and because we have lifespans like we do, the original generation that wanted to measure fitness and decided that reproductive success was a good place to start, they may well have understood that they were not the same thing. But because they got such a huge reward for going out there and measuring reproductive success, because it works most of the time, they trained their students. You go out and you measure reproductive success, and then they died off. And so the students don't even know it's a proxy. And so you get into this thing where you can't escape this loop, even if the original people who made the compromise could have.
This is so meta, because that sounds like the process of natural selection, what you're describing, right?
Well, let's put it this way.
But there's a little tinge of innovation on it, perhaps.
Well, human beings are, my PhD advisor called us the uniquely unique species.
Okay.
We have tools that other creatures don't, or we have tools augmented to a level that they don't look anything like the analogs in other creatures. And one of the things that we can do is we can model things in our minds so that we can play out how they interact. And that means that we can do a lot of work before we actually get to something that is physical. So I wish we did this better. I wish we had more deeply philosophical mentors who understand the relationship between the process that we call science and the practice of science, because those two things have become quite remote from each other. In fact, the reductionists who have effectively taken over scientists or science have staged a kind of coup against theory, and they've been aided in this coup by the universities, which are fueled on grant overhead. And because it's fueled on the universities fueled on grant overhead, theorists seem like a waste of space. But the problem is, theorists, if they're any good, they tell you where it is that it would be worth searching empirically.
Right.
Most space isn't worth searching because it's implausible there will be anything in it.
Yeah.
And knowing that, it pays tremendous dividends, right? It's like if you went and looked at a tree.
The search space is infinite, basically.
Right. And you can waste a lot of time, which actually gives a positive signal in the university environment, because you can run big experiments, that are fruitless and that a good theorist could have told you we're not going to net anything useful. But the point is, hey, it netted a grant that brought in $5 million. So that perverse incentive wrecks science. And we've lost track of how much we can do with careful thinking. And hopefully we will rediscover it.
On that, so that's a good incentive maybe to pull the thread on a little bit then. So this grant program inside of universities that you're saying is a perverse incentive, what's funding that? Do you know, like, where is that money coming from? And why is it being directed towards the empiricists and away from, I would call the theoreticians the rationalist typically. That's how, I don't know if that's the same framing you would use as like empiricism versus rationalism.
Not really. Theorists, first of all, we don't have, in biology, we have very few theorists these days. We treat theory, to the extent it exists at all, as an afterthought. In fact, you will hear people say things like, data is king, or let's see what the data say.
Right.
And we think that that is synonymous with science, that obviously what makes science special is that we go and check the reality in physical space. But no, this is an attack on a system that has two components. Reductionism is important. You have to engage in it. But the real payoff comes when you take all of the products of the reductionism and you go back and you do synthesis and you say, what story are all of these different results?
Right.
What are they pointing to?
The consilience between them.
Right.
Yeah.
And when that consilience hits, now you know something, right? Now you've got a model, and I don't mean a computer model, but you have a model that describes the universe in an important way.
Yeah.
So that really should be the point of the exercise. To your question, I think what has taken place is that there's a defect, and I know this will go to some of the other things that you like to think about, but there's a defect in the way we reward people in the component pieces of the system that result in something we call science. Each of those pieces becomes like a quasi-creature that starts trying to carve out territory and starts trying to persist into the future, right? Most of the elements of the system should want to minimize their own expense, right? You don't want the unproductive parts of the system to be any bigger than they need to be. You don't want them to be smaller than they have to be.
Yeah.
But, administrators don't see it that way.
Right.
Administrators understand a growth in the, resources at their disposal as a positive thing. So all of the elements of the system take on a life of their own, and people forget what the objective of the system was in the first place.
Wow. So yeah, you start to think about it like an ecology, and maybe this is the through line, right, between organs, organisms, and organizations, right? They have this, they're basically all survival strategies of one kind or another, right? Even a business, I guess you could say, is a survival strategy, right? It's trying to, or a fitness strategy, maybe is the more correct term. But they can come into conflict even when one of these organizations is trying to serve, say, a higher purpose. The pursuit of truth, I guess, would be kind of the overarching purpose for a university. But maybe the administrators in one of these particular functions inside the university, they're just trying to continue their pay stream, right? Because administration in particular, sorry to beat up on the administrators, but ideally we want to minimize the amount of administration expenditure that's occurring in any organization, right?
Yep.
You want production occurring, not administration. Administration is a necessary function to make production work, but you really want to keep it to a minimum, right? It's like minimizing your fixed costs and to maximize your productive output, basically. So I go back to, I guess I don't understand the flow of funds inside of these organizations. Like what is feeding the administrative layer in a way that, natural selection, if I may use that term, is not checking properly?
Well, actually, you hinted at it in the scaling up process that you were describing. There's a reason that we don't have this problem with our internal organs, right? They're an exception to this rule. Our organs are not, your heart is not trying to win a competition with your liver. In fact, it desperately wants not to win a competition with your liver because you'll die. So the reason that you don't get that competition is that all of the organs of which you are composed, they succeed in passing on the genetic information that led to them only if you as an organism succeed. So they are perfectly aligned. They are in perfect agreement about taking only what they need and no more, and when there's not enough, how they should divide it up and which cells should commit suicide, right? All of these things are without conflict because you share a genome across your entire soma. If universities worked like that, the administrators would be the same. If the administrators only got paid when the university succeeded in accomplishing the mission that's on the mission statement, then administrators would behave themselves. But that's not what happens, right? They have a conflict of interest, and so they effectively become parasites on that system. And anytime you reproduce that structure, you're going to see it. This is why Elon Musk was able to fire such a large percentage of Twitter's employees and make the place better, not worse.
Right. Is this just inherent then? Is this just inherent in the nature of scaling human organizations, that we're always going to have these conflicts of interest that arise at the different layers, and there's no systemic solution for it? We just have to constantly deal with it as it comes up? Like, are we ever going to find this equilibrium that is organism-like in human institutions?
No reason you can't find it. I think the problem, so I have a principle which is, within complex systems, you cannot blueprint a solution. If you try to blueprint a solution, you end up finding all sorts of unintended consequences.
Because that's for complicated systems, not complex systems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what you have to do is either prototype your way there or navigate your way there, so that you can adjust as you discover what the consequences are of the remedy you thought was going to work. You can pivot. There's no reason that you can't do that, but what you must do is avoid the conflict between levels of analysis. A successful administrator who's successful because they betray the mission of the organization is an avoidable problem. What you need to have is some mechanism that measures something that is highly correlated to what you're actually trying to achieve, and then rewards people on the basis of their contribution to it, which you will never do perfectly. Right. There will always be those conflicts, but what you want to do is try to minimize the delta between the incentives of the entity and the incentives of the components.
Right. What came up for me there, as you were saying, it was like the earnings per share bonus structures you see in corporate America. It's like that's sort of, you're trying to align executive interests with shareholder interest, basically. But then even that gets gamed a little bit, because then they do the share buybacks. Well, this is actually a fiat money problem, because you get access to cheap credit. You can borrow money at cheap rates. You can buy back your own shares, and you can game that metric essentially. But what in the university system, and sorry to keep going back to the grants, but like I still don't know what does that money come from? When you say grants, are they just private donors making these grants? Is this public?
Mostly not. It's mostly public money.
Oh, so it's printed money.
Yeah, it's printed money.
Oh,
exactly.
okay.
So it's perverse incentives all the way down.
Okay.
And when we get to the part of the conversation where we discover that somehow we're living in an era where, the only thing that's certain is that the experts are wrong, right? Why are the experts wrong across the board? It's you have a system in which the whole awarding of the hallmarks of expertise is riddled with perverse incentives. And in fact, anybody who attempts to straighten it out is going to be killed off because they're a threat to all of these people's fiefdoms.
Wow. Okay, so I'm going to draw a connection here. The inside of the modern academy, it's all Keynesian economics, as you're probably aware. That is an empirical version of economics, more or less, right? They've really tried to, they've applied a lot of metrics to things, like mathematizing it and applying metrics to things that the theorists, which are the Austrian economists, will tell you cannot quantify. For instance, Mises will tell you it's impossible to quantify inflation because it's as subjective as the process of valuation itself, right? It's subjective to the preferences of the individual. Yet the Keynesians will tell you, oh no, we have it all all the numbers say this, and here's the number. And then that number, of course, conveniently changes every decade when it gets too high. The metric that's supposed to predict price changes every time something inside that basket of goods changes too much, it gets excluded. So they can bring that number down into, expectations or what, it's a managed number basically. So not only was it, you can't create a metric for it to begin with, but even after that, it's engineered. Do you think the connection I want to draw is like, so those empirical Keynesian economists that have taken over the modern academy and they've excluded the theoreticians, which is Austrian economists, like, do you think this is a downstream effect of that possibly? That there's been an over-indexing on empiricism and an exclusion of theoreticians?
Sounds exactly parallel to what I have seen in science. And that doesn't mean it's arising for the identical reason. But this is why, if we go back to the initial question of fitness, to me, fitness is an easy concept to understand and an impossible concept to instantiate perfectly if you want to go measure it. But as long as you're cool with that and you realize you're measuring a proxy, you don't run into a problem. Fitness means the ability of a sequence to get into the future. Sequences want to get into the future. Genetic sequences are trying to get into the future. How far into the future? As far as they can get.
Is this replicators replicate? I've heard it put before.
That's a perfectly good way of thinking about it. But the point is, if you know that a sequence is trying to get into the future, or it is structured so as to increase the chances of getting into the future, and the farther into the future it gets, the better it has done.
Yeah.
Once you accept that, then you understand, there ought to be all kinds of circumstances in which reproducing more is not the way to do that, right? In fact, you are such a demonstration. Yeah. You are composed of some 30 trillion cells as an adult. If you wanted to increase your fitness by reproducing more, you could be 30 trillion individuals. That's a spectacular increase in fitness. Right. Why don't you do it? Because what you give up is the ability to get into the future. right?
Okay.
You have a spectacular ability to get into the future because of the coordinated control that you can exert on the universe around you. It's worth that trade.
Based on the cooperation internal.
Right.
To yourself. Wow.
100%.
Yeah.
So
This sounds like an economy, by the way.
right. So I guess the thing is, I don't think biology is as hard as we make it out to be, but it's a different art than people think it is. Figuring out where to stand is like the entire game, right? There's some place that you could stand that you can see the thing working, and it's like, well, of course it would work that way. But most people, they find some place to stand, and then they spend their entire career looking from that disadvantaged vantage point, and they never make sense of it. But once you understand getting into the future is the game rather than reproducing, oh my goodness, you just go around spotting places where reproduction is not helping your cause. And it's like, oh, you can find an example for every one of these things. It's easy.
Is this an example of like, as I, again, I'm not a biologist or doctor, but cancer is that, right? It's the unchecked replication of cells, and apoptosis or something is what keeps that in check. And if that's unchecked, then, it's a situation you're describing where reproduction actually is not enhancing the fitness of the organism.
Right. So for creatures like us, which are divided into vital organs, all of the organs are in perfect agreement about not taking more than their share because that doesn't get them into the future. We have interesting cases where that is not exactly true, like a mother and a fetus.
Oh, yeah.
They have high agreement on not taking too much, but not perfect agreement. And so this actually accounts for the fact that pregnancy is not a simple disease-free process. It's a fraught process. Actually, different mating systems predict different levels of illness for pregnancy because the alignment in interest between an individual fetus and its mother is going to be much higher if all of the future offspring of that mother are produced with the same father, right? So, the question of how much alignment there is crucial. Cancer, if cancer is in general what we think it is, it's a failure of the regulatory mechanisms. It's not, cancer doesn't want to reproduce because it kills the bearer of its genes in so doing. But at some point, regulatory mechanisms fail, and the cancer gets the better of you, and it does not pass itself on in that process. Now, there are exceptional cancers that do, and my bet would be we find that more of the cancers that we discover have a contagious component than we yet know.
Interesting. Have you ever wanted to live in an off-grid community with complete food, energy, and water independence? If so, then you need to check out the farm at Okefenokee. The farm is a pioneering community designed to foster longevity and well-being, eliminating elements that detract from these goals. At the farm, the convergence of nature, nutritious food, a supportive community, and the ethos of slowing down is unparalleled. Positioned at the gateway to the UNESCO World Heritage-nominated Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, the farm at Okefenokee stands as a testament to a lifestyle that truly nurtures health and happiness. Unlike conventional housing developments where a token communal garden may suffice, the farm itself is the community. Small, intimate microvillages seamlessly integrate into the fabric of a sprawling agricultural community. So if you're interested in joining this off-grid community, then go to okefarm.com today to learn more about becoming a member. Make sure to tell them that I sent you for a $21,000 discount on their custom cabin pricing. Again, go to okefarm.com to learn more about joining this revolutionary regenerative agriculture community. Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com. I just thought this was a very insightful quote that we pulled from one of your recent conversations, I think with Jordan Peterson. Correct me if I'm wrong. You said that what you have to do is create a landscape of incentives that is ruinous for those who attempt to corrupt it. If you don't do that, you will create an evolutionary arms race in which those who are wishing to corrupt your system for whatever reason are seeking those quadrants where you can't detect them. I would love to hear you expand upon exactly what you mean here, and really opening up that word corruption too. I know it's etymologically related to rupture, actually, which is an interesting biological term, but has a lot more meanings beyond the biological. So what did you mean by this particular phrase?
Well, let's say we agree that we should have a governance structure because we who are the governed are better off if that structure does its job than in its absence.
Yeah, if it preserves life, liberty, and property, all for it.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay, we agree consent to the governed is essential. We agree that we want to have an empowered system that's capable of, let's say, helping us avoid a tragedy of the commons or a race to the bottom, so that we all succeed better than we would if it was, all against all. Well, what you don't want to do is set up a system in which somebody who decides to extract resources from that system rather than supply the right level of resources for it to do the job that we've all agreed it should do, if that person is slapped on the wrist for attempting to corrupt the system when you catch them, then actually they've got a reasonably good strategy because you won't catch them all the time.
Right. Okay.
And so you don't catch them all the time, which means they've got a cost of doing business, which is the slap on the wrist they get each time they get caught. And they've got information about the system, which is, when I do it this way, it doesn't get noticed. So I'm going to stop doing it the way I keep getting slapped on the wrist, and I'm going to do it in the way that I don't get slapped on the wrist, and then it's all profit. Okay. So now I'm training this corrupting force, this parasite, to be a better parasite, to be more effective at evading detection and to reap a higher profit. I don't want that arms race.
Right.
So my point is, to get the system to work, you want people to be rewarded for contributing positively to it, right? I am a big fan of the idea that you should get wealthy by creating wealth that we all benefit from, right? We do not want equal outcomes. Equal outcomes will,
Of course.
they kill
We're only
because-
equal in the grave, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So what you want is opportunity distributed as broadly as possible. You want excellent rewards for contributing. The more you contribute, the more you should be rewarded. But again, if somebody decides to concentrate the opportunity so it only exists for a limited number of people, they're actually harming all of us. Right? Because how many people who would have contributed something don't have the opportunity to do it, and so we don't get to benefit from it. So You don't want to create the arms race that trains people to be excellent parasites, which means that the cost for discovering, when you discover a parasite, the cost has to be ruinous, so that instead of coming out ahead and paying the cost of doing business for the places that you got spotted, that any attempt to find where you can't be seen results in a massive setback. If it results in a massive setback, then all of the the early attempts to figure out where the gaps in surveillance are, they all perish. And who succeeds? All of the people who decided, you know what, I'm not going to try to figure out how to parasitize the system. I'm going to try to figure out how to contribute to the system, because that's how I get rewarded, right? It's that simple.
So make parasitism unprofitable.
Make it
in an energetic way.
Right.
And financial way.
Don't make the mistake of thinking that making it somewhat unprofitable is enough, because if it's somewhat unprofitable, then all of the cases in which you didn't detect it are going to overwhelm whatever fine you have imposed, and it will still be profitable.
Yes. Okay. That is an excellent point. This might be a step back, but I think it's an important one. So my understanding of the word corruption, at least in socioeconomics, is an uneven application of the rules. We've heard the word lawfare thrown around a lot recently, where, well, there's a law. It's supposed to apply to everyone evenly, right? We're all equal in the eyes of the law. This is like a principle at the bottom of Western civilization. But when you get in, and this is one equality that I think we really should keep, equality in the eyes of the law, not equality of outcomes, not even equality of opportunity, by the way, because we're all born different in different places, different times. Agreed, strive to make opportunity as broadly distributed as possible, but it's not something we can equalize per se.
It will never be perfectly equal.
Yes.
You want it as equal as possible.
But we can have perfect equality in the eyes of the law.
Must.
In theory, I mean, we could. We haven't seen it in practice so much. And then so corruption would be inequality in the eyes of the law in a socioeconomic sense. So what is the value of universally or evenly applied laws in preventing corruption?
Well, I mean, I think you spotted it, which is when we say that we all benefit from having opportunity as evenly available as can be made, to the extent that the law is scrutinizing your finances more than it's scrutinizing someone else's finances, that's an opportunity for them that doesn't exist for you. They can cheat where you can't.
Right.
So I would say that corruption is born of a failure, often a cryptic failure, to agree on the values around which your structure is built. And values are really, values are the objectives of the system. What do you want it to achieve? And then there are the structures which are going to fall short of achieving the values perfectly, and you want them to fall short as little as possible. It would be great if the structures got better over time at achieving those values. But basically, I am a huge fan of the idea that the rules posted at the door are the key to a functional civilization, right? I don't want to participate in a civilization with people who do not believe in equal protection under the law. Right? My feeling is either you get that principle or you don't. And if you don't, I can't trust you.
You're referring to something like the Bill of Rights when you say posted at the door?
Yeah,
okay.
Something like that. Yeah. And, the Bill of Rights I take to be a prototype that was, I believe, as good as could have been achieved given what was understood at the time. I mean, the founders didn't know about evolution, and so they didn't understand that they were building a system with the component parts that would cause it to evolve, and therefore maybe they didn't anticipate some of the failures. But yeah, rules posted at the door says, look, we are not going to equalize outcomes, for example. We are going to attempt to equalize opportunity, and we are not going to obsess over inefficiencies of the system, right? The fact that opportunity is not perfectly evenly distributed is not a reason to overthrow the system.
Right. So no wokeism.
Right. No wokeism. Right. We all want everybody to have equal opportunity. We agree that nothing's perfect,
But
right?
it's an ideal.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
will never be. An engineer builds tolerances in because you can't make two parts that are exactly the right size. You'll never get them together. But yeah, having agreed on the basic values, then the question is, well, what's the structure that achieves our objectives best?
So these basic values, I mean, now this gets deep because now there's almost a religious substructure to the ethical substructure to the legal substructure, right? Like we have the King James Bible at the bottom of Western civilization, more or less. So thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, things like this become codified as the rules posted at the door. I mean, I guess that's not exactly the Bill of Rights, but we build towards that, as you said, like those are the basic primitives, and we build towards these bigger and better prototypes over time. Private property seems to be like a very important one of those, right? It's kind of like thou shalt not steal, basically, in a socially institutionalized form. And to the end of rewarding those who are productive and not rewarding those or even punishing those who are parasitical. Private property does seem to be that thing, right? Because if someone violates your private property, well, then you can sue them in the court of law and introduce ruinous costs to them, at least pre-limited liability. There's a lot of distortions that have occurred in the modern day, but that's the theory, at least. And then also, well, when you consensually serve other people and solve their problems and they pay you for it, well, that's how you can build legit, honest wealth, let's say. So what's the importance of the integrity of private property to this process you're describing of rewarding productive and penalizing the parasitical?
All right, I'm going to come back to that, but I want to pick up an important point. At the end of the day, I don't believe, and maybe the reason that you started with a religious underpinning, is that absent such an untestable metaphysical claim, you can't really ground any of this should stuff in the physics of the universe.
Right. Can't get it out from an is, right?
Yeah, and this has profound and immediate implications. I literally cannot defend and do not believe that anybody could properly defend the idea that it is better to be alive than dead.
Yeah, I mean, you can't defend the contrary, right?
I mean, on what basis is it better?
Yeah.
And the answer is, well, as a living creature, it's better. But,
it's
my bias is built in.
It's a performative contradiction by a living creature to say that.
Right.
Right.
So if we say, well, actually, it's not really superior. It's more organized, right? But it's not really superior.
Right.
Then the question is, well, can we accept that for all of us who are doing the arguing about this, we prefer to be alive than to be dead? And the answer is, oh, yeah, it's a slam dunk, right? In fact, you can prove that everybody feels this way because pretty much everybody,
Anyone
decides to take their next breath.
Exactly.
Right?
Anyone that hasn't killed themselves is performing it, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so then the point is, okay, I'm not claiming that this is grounded in the physics, but once you get to life, life is good,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And I also think then you can say, well, is all life good? If you were, strapped to a rack being tortured every minute of every day, is that life good?
Right.
No, I don't think so. So there's something to being, in a life that has rewarding characteristics, that isn't all suffering.
Yeah.
Does that mean you want it to be all pleasure? Nope. That would turn you into a awful, unproductive something. So a life in which you are free, you struggle, you suffer from your bad judgment, you profit by becoming insightful and wise. That's the life that we want. That's
and profit in serving others, right?
Right.
Yeah.
In producing something of value, either through your work or your insight or your compassion or your sense of beauty or whatever it is. So once we get there, then I think it becomes really obvious that, agreeing that the step at the bottom is just, I like life better than not life. We have an obligation to deliver to as many human beings as we can the most liberated, meaningful opportunity at life that we can deliver. Does that mean maximizing the population on the planet? No. It means preserving the opportunity to live here indefinitely into the future, figuring out how many people the planet can handle and not stretching it to its limits, right? I don't know what that number is. I think there's a lot of discussion about the population being too low and dropping and the catastrophe. I really don't know what the number that the planet can tolerate is.
And there's arguments on the other side from the globalists, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
And all I want is an honest discussion of it where we can figure out, are we above carrying capacity? Are we below it? How do we stabilize so that we, don't create a demographic problem for ourselves? But
And it's dynamic anyways, because as innovation changes, our carrying capacity changes.
right. And, the quality of our lives change, right?
Yeah.
And so, I want people to have this as a delightful experience, and every minute of it is precious, and I want as many people to get a shot at that as we can give.
Yeah.
But, packing the maximum number of people on the planet is not the way to do it. But all that said, if our obligation is to preserve this opportunity as long as we can, then that creates an obligation towards, dare I say, sustainability. Right, which I know is a dirty word because it's been so abused by folks on the ostensible left.
Yes. Yeah.
But nonetheless, if we were to, take all of the stigma away from that term, I think we have an obligation not to deliver the next generation a worse planet than we inherited.
Yes. No, anyone that doesn't agree with that, by the way, I think is got a problem. I mean, I don't know how you couldn't agree with that, right?
Right.
As
At
a
least you
mature,
gotta go back and
as a
rethink
mature living adult, right? Like maybe there's some selfish teenagers that haven't seen it all yet, but yeah, it's a gift.
Yeah.
Right. And it's in a way our purpose, our duty, I guess, to afford that gift, the furtherance of that gift to later generations, right? And it's not, again, as you said, there's no ought from an is. This isn't coded into the universe necessarily, but we do value being alive by virtue of the way we act and are. And so we know that about ourselves. We can presume that about future generations, that we should then give them the optimal conditions to flourish, basically.
Which I think...
I'm going to look up a quote. I'm going to listen to you, but I have something... You're sounding like a Randian to me, so I want to pull up this quote.
So I think that this philosophical view actually solves an important problem. If you start thinking about species as sacred by virtue of the fact that they exist, and you start arguing, well, does every species of mosquito have a right to exist? Does every pathogen that's ever evolved have a right to be preserved? My answer is hell no. Right? We actually should center our calculation of the planet that we are passing on human values.
Yes, of course.
And allow for the possibility that future generations will value things that we haven't found the value in yet.
Yes.
But this means you can, figure out whether or not Anopheles mosquitoes could be driven extinct. Maybe that's a way to get rid of malaria. Maybe that would be net negative, but there's a strong argument it would be net positive. But hard to imagine an argument in which you don't have to preserve the oceans so that they sustain orcas.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Future generations have a right to live on a planet with orcas.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I think that by focusing on humans, you actually end up with a natural guide to what in nature we are obligated to preserve.
I could not agree more, right? That it has to serve human purposes because it's biological, right? If we're not serving human purposes, well, then we won't be here to whatever we're not protecting now or not doing right, like we won't even be here to do it right in the future. And
if you think about this, right, the thing that we talked about fitness, what is fitness really? Fitness is the ability to get as far into the future as you can.
Right.
We have just spelled out the program for doing the best job we can based on what we know now.
Yes. Okay. So I am in total agreement with you. I think my view as a libertarian would be that private property is this strategy, at least the basis of this strategy. Obviously, it's complicated, right? You need the rule of law. You need these rules written at the door, things like this, principles of governance to get people organized. But fundamental to that, I really do think, is private property. And when you were saying a quote earlier, this is the Rand quote that came up for me. Ayn Rand, of course, said, "The right to life is the source of all rights," which I think is what you were saying when you said life is good, right? And the right to property is their only implementation. Without property rights, no other rights are possible. This is actually the shorter version of it, but she basically says later that if a man doesn't have the rights to the product of his own effort, and it is his effort that sustains his life, then he does not have his right to life, basically. So I'm sorry to keep taking it back to property rights, but I'm like, I'm trying to understand if there's anything. I mean, it sounds overly simplistic. I don't want to be, a hammer looking at everything as if it's a nail, but is there something more complicated than this, than like getting us into a world that really takes the preservation of private property very seriously? So even that dynamic equilibrium you're talking about, like what is the carrying capacity of the planet? It's like, well, no one can ever really know at any point in time. But what we could say is like, well, how about no one kill anyone and no one steal from anyone, which is basically preserve private property, and we'll just find out what it is. Is there something? Is there more of a central planning force that needs to be introduced to this, or do you think we could get by with just this emergent self-organization with private property at its foundation?
I believe what we should be shooting for is an absolutely minimal structure. And the analog is the structure that governs us as organisms. Mm-hmm. So you are a tightly governed organism. And that governance does not feel oppressive. You barely detect it. And that's what we should be shooting for, is something so elegant that it does not interfere with you. And in fact, it leaves you free to navigate at an intuitive level without having to be mindful or fearful. Uh-huh. So I will say I'm on a bit of my own journey with respect to libertarianism. I used to regard libertarianism as an absurdity because of its failures. And I think that its failures come down to largely an inability to address externalities and game theoretic failures. Okay. That said, I now take libertarianism very seriously. Mm. And the reason is that I'm watching what I suspect is an upgrade, a 2.0 version of libertarianism emerging. So I would classify myself as a small L libertarian. I think freedom is the only value that you can reasonably maximize.
Yes.
Right?
Amen to that.
And there's a reason that it's the only one. If you maximize anything else, it causes all the other values to crash. So even if the value you're trying to maximize is something lovely like justice, right? You're going to get a unproductive, cold, you're going to basically divide nothing evenly. Yeah. Right? That's not a desirable system. But in the case of liberty, if you maximize liberty, liberty is inherently integrative. Yeah. You have to have solved the other problems to do it. So if you set out to maximize liberty, you're going to end up addressing all of the other issues and balancing their competing concerns.
Yes. I'm so happy to hear you say that, because the way I describe what I think is what you're saying as well is that freedom is the only principle that's self-limiting, actually. So if you maximize freedom, right? If we're actually maximizing and universalizing individual freedom, well, then my right to profit, stops where your private property and body begins. So in maximizing my freedom, I am limited by your freedom, basically. So it's the only one of those principles that actually has the self-limitation built into it. So you don't get the paperclip machine problem, right? Where you engineer an AI to produce paperclips and the universe fills up with paperclips. This has a limiting principle built into it.
Yep.
By virtue of its definition.
Right. It has a wisdom built into it.
Yes.
So I'm all ears if we're having that conversation about libertarianism. And I really see it as a 2.0 version of libertarianism.
And I call it freedom maximalism, by the way. So the term you just said, maximizing freedom, like that's
love it.
The term, yeah.
As long as we recognize that this is again a case where you cannot instantiate perfectly.
Yeah.
We have to be aware that if we try to maximize people's liberty in the present, that we may actually ultimately limit liberty, right? That's an error we should not allow ourselves. All right. Again, we're trying to provide as much liberty to as many people over the remainder of human history as we can. If we steal from the future in order to be more liberated now, that's cheating.
Right.
So somehow you have to prevent that, and that's not easy to do.
Yeah. I would again take it back to private property, because it's like each person that's kind of running their own calculations on their own stuff, they know, like if I have a capital interest in an asset, I know what's best for that asset to keep it productive into the future, right? And if you dump pollution on it, well, then I'll sue you, and all these things. Like it's this skin in the game element, right? There's this old, I think it was Aristotle, when everyone owns everything, nobody takes care of anything. Mm-hmm. So when you have social, like public property is basically an oxymoron, right? It's just there's no accountability mechanism built into that. But with private property, you do have this, we often call it private property rights, but there's equally a responsibility. If you don't take care of that asset, well, you're not going to have a thing to have rights to.
So, well, I suspect I disagree with you here,
okay,
because, something like Yosemite or the Pacific Ocean, one of these things is publicly held. The other one is a no man's land. Mm-hmm. The no man's land is jeopardized by a lot of people who own private property over extracting from it. So you have a tragedy of the commons. Mm-hmm. Yosemite, if it wasn't publicly owned, would be real estate in the hands of the ultra wealthy, presumably. And that does not strike me as the ideal, most liberating way for it to be held. I also think, the fact that you happen to own a mountaintop at the moment, does that really entitle you to take that mountaintop off to access the coal within it? I doubt that. Mm-hmm. Again, you're stealing from future generations because it's profitable in the present. So I'm not saying I know the answers to those questions.
Yeah, that one's hard.
It's tough.
No.
But let's just say this is one of these things where we can agree in principle that liberty is good. I would also point out that there is a radical distinction between formal liberty, things that you are technically free to do, and realized liberty, things that you are actually free to do. I'm not really interested in formal liberty. I'm interested in actual liberty. And sometimes actual liberty is increased by regulation. So let's take a couple examples. If everybody was free to decide which side of the road to drive on, we'd all be less free.
Of course. Yeah,
right? We'd be technically freer, but in practice, we'd be a lot less free. We'd have to drive at 15 miles per hour not to crash into people. Right. So we benefit. We are more free because there's a regulation that says you drive on the right side of the road.
Well, social consensus. I don't know if it needs the regulation or not.
Okay. I think I'm okay with either way. But
because we can have social consensus on some things that aren't regulated, like gold being money, for instance. Like that was a point of social consensus that emerged rather than it was bottom up rather than top down.
Yep.
So that would be my only quibble with that.
Well, but I would argue that the best way to get the social consensus on which side of the road to drive on is to make it illegal to drive on the other side so that you can drive up the cost to anybody who decides, hey, you know what? I think we're driving on the wrong side of the road and I'm going to start a movement to go drive on the other side. But let's take another example.
It's a good example, though, and it gets to the consent of the governed thing.
Yeah.
Which is,
And I like it because it's a slam dunk.
Yeah.
Like, how much liberty do you give up agreeing to drive always on the right side of the road? Not much.
It's also a great example of the sacrificing a smaller freedom for a larger freedom.
Right. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Likewise, I would say, and this is an example that's not going to age well over very long timescales, but the regulations that make air travel possible and safe are terrifically liberating. but there's nothing more regulated than air travel.
Right.
Right? I mean, this is a space where, you can sit on the tarmac for 3 hours because a warning light goes on, and that requires you to check the system in question when in fact probably it's just a faulty sensor, right?
Yeah.
So heavily regulated space, but it means you can go to an airport and be halfway around the world, in less than a day and experience an entirely different culture. That's a tremendous amount of liberty, like something that, 200 years ago, nobody could dream of.
Crazy, yeah.
So anyway, as long as we're on board with the idea that we should be doing things that actually increase people's liberty, I'm all ears.
No, it's an excellent point. And I think we won't go round and round, but I think most of the problems with, say, a true libertarian or freedom maximalist viewpoint is that it's all unseen. We've never seen a world like that. So we can't really say what would air traffic regulation be like in a, pure libertarian or freedom maximalist world. It doesn't mean you can't have regulation. It just tends to mean that things are a little more like English common law tradition and a little less fiat legislation, right? It's not just someone coming into office, signing a law saying you do this now.
Right.
It's more like, hey, we've observed how these things have worked for a long time. And we're codifying what has been discovered basically in law rather than just imposing arbitrary law.
Yeah.
And so that is, I'm all good with, but it challenges, the challenging thing is we're talking about an abstract reality that doesn't exist. It's like, well, what would it be like if we actually had this true libertarian world and we're self-organizing in this way? So that's the difficulty, I think. And it's not, I don't have a great answer for it. It's just a statement that.
No, but I think this is perfect, because what I believe you and I will agree on is that what it should say on the door is we are in favor of whatever system maximally liberates people in a meaningful sense over the long term, right? If that system turns out to be a pure libertarian system in the sense that you mean it, I'm cool with that. If that turns out really to liberate more people more meaningfully, great. I don't think it's going to. I think there's going to be some sweet spot.
Yeah.
Do I know how to name it? I sure don't.
Right.
But I know how to get there, which is you make a reasonable guess as to where you will increase freedom in what way.
Yeah.
You instantiate in a careful enough manner that you can then actually check what the consequence of the change was. Mm-hmm. And if you decrease liberty rather than increase liberty by doing it, then hey, whatever you thought was going to happen shouldn't be the guide. What did happen should be the guide. So you can navigate.
Yes. Okay. Then I would say it's safe to assume you would be an advocate for more experimentation in that regard, right? If we had more experimentation with different types of governance structures to see what achieved this optimal sweet spot of human flourishing or freedom. So
pending one requirement. Mm-hmm. So I'm very frustrated by what the phase of history we've just gone through, because many people will say that, the COVID vaccines were the greatest medical experiment in human history. No, they weren't, because we didn't monitor the outcome. When we say experiment, it requires us to monitor the outcome so we at least have some sense of the consequence of what we did. And it's not going to be something you can do perfectly because, again, if you're trying to maximize liberty over an indefinitely long future, you can't monitor what the consequence is 200 years from now from some change you just made.
Right.
But you can take a pretty good guess. If I've significantly increased people's liberty in the present, and I haven't done so at the cost of something I can't replace, probably that's a liberty increasing mode.
Right. That's so simple and true, but I'm immediately drawn to the devil's in the details, right? Where probably the people spraying glyphosate pesticides all over crops 60 years ago were thinking they were doing that, right? Like, oh, we're fixing the bug problem.
Yep.
And again, I don't know the deep history here. Maybe there's more of a conspiracy theory behind it. I'm just picking an example out of thin air where humans try to do the right thing that they think they're benefiting present and future generations, only to discover the unforeseen consequence X decades later that, oh, wait, in solving the bug problem, we gave everyone a metabolic sickness problem.
Yep.
And so are we all just, that's the human condition? We're just navigating between those buoys?
Well, we do have a problem, which is that we have a lot of complicated mindsets trying to navigate complex systems.
Mm-hmm.
And the delicate nature of human physiology is easily disrupted by stuff that seems like it should be fine because you can't think of a reason it isn't, and then it turns out, wow, have you done a lot of harm? So there is a requirement. You can get there a couple different ways. The precautionary principle drives people crazy because it's so hard to instantiate it in a way that isn't just absolutely paralytic. On the other hand, informed consent
Yes.
is, to me, essentially a sacred value.
Right.
To the extent that you want to spray some stuff on some wheat because you don't think it's going to hurt me, I don't trust you, right? I want to be able to know where that stuff is and avoid it completely. And if you're spraying it into the air because the FDA hasn't figured out that the amount in the air is bad for me, I don't trust the FDA, right? I want the ability to say no. And if you think that coating vegetables in some, polymer or whatever it is that keeps them fresher over longer supply chains, if you think that's perfectly safe, put it on the damn label so I can not buy it.
Yeah. I'd love that you said that. Okay, I want to wrestle with this with you now. Informed consent, agreed, sacred value. Is there then an incentive by centralized powers, or can there be an incentive by centralized powers to not inform the population about how certain things work so that you can sort of get around that? And I will give you the fiat currency example. I actually think fiat currency is sort of I know it is not a direct health outcome, but it is a wealth outcome. And people not understanding that fiat currency is designed to violate their property rights through the debasement of currency causes them to hold it in their savings account in a way, to an extent I don't think they otherwise would.
That's interesting.
So it's like there, and then there's the whole Keynesian economic paradigm that's meant to sort of keep that obfuscation in place, because if you had the actual information about what it's doing, then you would have informed consent, and then something like that would violate informed consent in an economic respect. What are your thoughts about that? Because, and I'm trying to take this now into central banking a little bit. It's like, okay, if we do need these stable laws, equality in the eyes of the law, to have non-corrupt systems, to have informed consent, right? Like to keep that universal. What do we do about an institution that's basically violating everyone's private property all the time through money printing? Like that seems to be really shaking the tree of our civilizational stability.
Yeah, it's terrifying. It breaks an obvious feedback. We should want a system where you suffer from your own bad judgment.
Right.
And the money printers don't suffer from their bad judgment. We suffer from their bad judgment. So to the greatest extent possible, you want the rewards and penalties in the system to track the generation of wealth that is something from which we all benefit and the avoidance of harm. So yes, I'm dead set against leaving people the right to print money in this way, because that is theft, and I had never thought about it before. But of course it causes people to hoard money that might otherwise be doing something productive, because you have no idea what its value will be 10 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's the amount of distortions it creates. Basically, when you have a money printer, right, you're incentivized to keep people in the dark about the consequences of money printing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get in this very vicious cycle of, well, I can print money to manufacture consent or media narratives that support, or even entire economic paradigms like Keynesian economics to support and justify the monopoly and printing of money. So it's a vicious circle. And do you think there are political solutions to that? Is there something we can do?
I mean, it's weird that I'm going to be raising it, but obviously there is. I mean, I'm no expert on Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, but the idea that you can't print them is a mechanism that solves this problem 100%. Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, you are. I was actually going to ask you if there were political solutions. And when I said political, I meant, yeah, we consider Bitcoin to be kind of like a political solution, a non-political solution to that, right? It's a new technology. But the perspective of Bitcoiners is that we see a lot of these consequences, these negative consequences of everything we've talked about today occurring. And people want to say, vote harder or propose some political solution. But most Bitcoiners don't see, like, what is the political solution? What voting can help, I guess, marginally here and there, but I don't think we're going to vote the Fed out of existence, for instance.
Well, it's an interesting moment to say that. I don't know what's about to happen, but we could obsolete the Fed out of existence.
Yeah.
Now, I don't, obviously, Bitcoin contains the rudiments of a system that can supplant the Fed and the money printers, but I don't think it's ready. And, it's too hard to use, and its value fluctuates too much. So in order for it to supplant the dollar, it needs to overcome those obstacles.
Yes. Do you want to give your kids a foundation of freedom and understanding of Bitcoin and a healthy skepticism of government? Then you should try Tuttle Twins. It's a cartoon about a grandma with a time-traveling wheelchair who takes her grandkids on hilarious adventures to learn about economics and freedom. Think the education of Magic School Bus meets the comedy of The Simpsons. With Tuttle Twins, your kids can learn about Bitcoin from Satoshi Nakamoto, civil disobedience from Harriet Tubman, natural rights from John Locke, and how to destroy the economy from Karl Marx. Today, Hollywood greenlights a lot of woke content or mindless garbage. Each episode of Tuttle Twins is parent-funded, parent-vetted, and only released when it's parent-approved. Because Tuttle Twins is fan-funded, it was the world's first kids show to teach about Bitcoin. That episode alone has been seen over 40 million times and was tweeted about by Michael Saylor. You can watch episodes of Tuttle Twins for free right now. And if you like what you see, you can use code BREEDLOVE for 10% off a subscription to the Angel Studios app and watch all of the episodes. So go to angel.com/breedlove to discover Tuttle Twins today. And remember to use code BREEDLOVE for 10% off. One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. Do you think you know who will win the presidential election or how many seats the Democrats or Republicans will win in the House or Senate? Well, there's finally a legal way to bet on the outcome of these elections via a platform called Kalshi. Kalshi is the first legal exchange where you can bet on any event, including but not limited to elections. Kalshi has markets on who will win the presidential election, who will control the House and Senate, who will win swing states, and more. Kalshi is already being used by hundreds of thousands of people and has facilitated over $1 billion worth of trades. Let's take an example. Right now, Trump and Kamala are trading about 50-50, meaning you can place a bet on either and you will double your money if they end up winning. That's pretty good, and Kalshi has hundreds of markets just like this for you to go and play in. So go to kalshi.com/breedlove today to start playing in this predictions market. The first 500 traders who deposit $50 will get a free $20 credit. Again, that's kalshi.com, KALSHI.com/breedlove. So you recently had an event called Rescue the Republic. And what were you trying to do there? I mean, I guess you're trying to save the world, rescue the constitutional republic that is the U.S. Like, what was the aim of that event?
Well, the original name of the event was Defend the West.
Okay.
And it became Rescue the Republic as we realized the concentrated nature of the jeopardy that we faced. So we thought of it as Rescue the Republic to save the West. And in my conceptualization, the West is an agreement on a level playing field. It is an agreement to put aside where you come from, color of your skin, all of those things, and to partner with people based on the fact that they bring something to the table that's worth partnering with. And if we do that, we get a safer, fairer, more rewarding, more dynamic civilization, something that frankly has been contagious when it has functioned, because people who see the dynamism of the West, they want in, because of course any reasonable person would. So the mission was to revitalize that commitment, to remind Americans of how much we agree on, which is to say a huge amount. We've been led to believe that we don't see eye to eye, but really, aside from a couple of fringes, the majority of Americans agree on almost all of the important stuff. And we live in an era of profound political reorganization. And we felt that it was important to gather the vast post-political, non-ideological unity movement physically so that we could begin to understand who we are. Because either we're about to win an election and we have to figure out what we want and how to get our representatives to deliver it, or something else is going to happen and we're going to have to exert pressure on the system in order to protect our way of life.
I take it that means when you say we're going to win an election, I assume you mean Trump won the election.
Well, I don't want to speak for Rescue the Republic on that front.
Okay.
But I will say personally, I don't see another option here.
Right.
I've been a Democrat my whole life. I'm still a Democrat, and I retain my status as a Democrat so that people will understand the full gravity when I say that party no longer stands for any of the things that it once did,
Right.
and that there's no saving it. This is like a rabid dog. I don't care how sentimental you are about the early history of that dog. At this point, the Democratic Party has to be put down, and the Republican Party isn't the one that we remember, right? Trump decapitated that party. He brought a vast group of people in, people who I regard as primarily members of labor who were cut loose from the Democratic Party by Bill Clinton when he was in office. So that MAGA wave was really working class people who showed up in the Republican Party where one would not have expected them. And now you have a much larger group, something much bigger than MAGA, which is now coalescing under the red banner. So I think one of these parties is unrecoverable. The other one is unrecognizable. And from the perspective of what happens next, I do not want to find out what happens if the blue team wins. I think the weakness of their candidate tells us that, you know, having a pure figurehead is not an anomaly of the Biden years, that's actually the new normal as far as they're concerned. And Trump, I think, appears to have grown from the experience that he has had since 2016. He's learned some of the lessons of the failures of the first Trump administration. He's now partnering with this large coalition of highly competent, insightful, broad-minded people. And I'm afraid of what's going to happen in this election, but I'm also pretty excited about the possibility.
Ooh, yeah, I'm admittedly. There's the song by the Police, "We Are Spirits in a Material World." The opening lines, I often quote them. There is no political solution to our troubled evolution. Have no faith in Constitution. There is no bloody revolution. And so I'm always very skeptical of political solutions, but I have been seriously sold on Trump as like an existential turning point for this country. How did the again, I'm not a political guy, so you're not going to hurt my feelings at all. How did the Democratic Party become what it is now? It sounds very parasitical and insofar as what we were talking about earlier.
I think there's I do think that Bill Clinton innovated. So the way I see it, the Republican Party was more or less the party of management, and the Democratic Party was more or less the party of labor. That's the world I was born into. Mm-hmm. The Republican Party was corrupted by corporate influence, and the Democratic Party was corrupted by labor unions. Mm-hmm. But Bill Clinton innovated the idea of turning the Democratic Party into a second corporate party, which initially made sense because there isn't a corporate viewpoint. There may be competing corporate viewpoints. So, if oil was housed over in the Republican Party, oil might have competing interests with big tech. And so anyway, there was room for two corporate parties. So he cut labor adrift, which was an ironic thing to do because backing labor is always a winning strategy because there are just simply so many workers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So counterintuitive, but nonetheless, he cut labor loose, became a second corrupt corporate party, basically copying the Republican strategy, which left labor politically homeless. They were politically homeless until Donald Trump, a populist, brought them into the Republican Party, which surprised everybody.
Gotcha.
And I think...
So this is a populist movement, you're saying?
It is clearly a populist movement, and it has become a much broader populist movement in 2024.
Yeah.
So we can say a lot of things about Donald Trump, but I do believe he did something that even those of us who think carefully about politics and think outside the box might have imagined was impossible, which is he almost single-handedly beat the duopoly. He decapitated the Republican Party, and I believe he has decimated the Democratic Party. And we owe him a huge debt of gratitude for that.
What are your thoughts about, and he started with the idea, flirting with the idea of eliminating tax on tips, then it was eliminating taxes on something else, then he, most recently, from what I saw, flirting with the idea of abolishing the IRS and income tax altogether and just funding the government on tariffs. What are your thoughts about that radical fiscal reform?
I love the idea of radical fiscal reform because I don't know if you know this, but I've described myself as a reluctant radical for, I don't know, 5, maybe 10 years at this point. The reason I say reluctant radical is that I believe radical change is very dangerous. Anybody who likes the idea of radical change for its own sake is an insane person. Yeah. I support the idea of radical change because I think our predicament is serious enough that nothing short of radical change can save us. So I feel like we have to contemplate radical changes and we have to appreciate how dangerous it is that we're in that predicament. So I like the idea that we're hearing truly radical ideas from Trump. Do I know whether or not it makes sense to abolish the income tax? Well, that really depends on what he means by replacing them with tariffs and what the net impact would be, which, there may be people who have a pretty good guess, but nobody can be certain. Yeah. But I'm open to it. And
the spending cut, the spending cuts, I don't know if this is directly related to that proposal, but I've also heard, I guess this is getting more into the Elon Musk territory where they're talking about cutting $2 or $3 trillion out of the government budget.
Well, this is funny. I have, in addition to becoming much more open to libertarians of late. I've also spent a lot of time with them, and I hear them say lots of things that I would have once considered ridiculous about getting rid of this department and that department. And what I try to tell them is we are living in an era of malignant governance, right? So virtually any of these things that you did away with would be an advantage because at the moment it's a disease.
Right.
But be careful what you wish for, right? The fact that we live under malignant governance does not mean that governance is malignant inherently. And so, again, what I want to see is a minimized structure, as minimal as possible, that interferes as little as possible, but something that helps us correct the defects in the market so that we can achieve as much liberty, as meaningful as it can exist, as meaningfully as it can exist.
So you have a view consistent with the founding fathers, it sounds like.
Very much so. I'm a huge fan.
Okay. So getting us back to an actual constitutional republic, here are the enumerated things government can never do.
Right.
Decentralized powers, checks and balances.
Sacrosanct rights, checks and balances. I believe, there's a dumb way to understand the government that governs best, governs least.
Yeah.
And there's a smart way, and I'm for the smart way. I agree. You want as small a structure as possible.
Yeah.
I'm for subsidiarity, where things are governed at the lowest level possible.
Yeah. Keep government local, basically.
Well, there are certain, I want the oceans protected.
Sure.
Right? We depend on them. That can't really be done locally. So as much as it terrifies people who are libertarian-minded to hear that I want to see anything done at global scale, I know that there are certain things that have to be.
Yeah, it's so tricky. I mean, I agree with you, but then that is the trap door through which all this bullshit rhetoric flows.
I know it.
It's like that. Well, the Green New Deal, right? They were going to print $100 trillion to save the weather, right? It's like, come on. Like, okay, do we need to take care of the environment? Of course we do. We need ecological responsibility, conservation, all these things. But printing $100 trillion is not going to fix the weather. So, how do we stop the smuggling in? Right, like it's almost, and maybe we're back to wokeism a little bit here. This attack on the terminology itself inhibits us from having productive conversations about it. And if we can't have rational discourse, then we end up in the domain of just raw power, in which the centralized state, is dominant. Because national defense is another one of those things that only the centralized state can do.
Yes, and unfortunately, I think we make an error that trips us up again and again. We have a lot of places where we have something I would call a 3-generation problem. What do we do about the universities? Well, they're full of perverse incentives. But if you fix the perverse incentives in the universities, they won't work. Why? There's nobody to staff them, right? They're staffed by morons, right? The faculty is full of people who believe nonsense. That's a solvable problem, but you can't solve it in a generation. You have to start by teaching people to think in a new way. And eventually you get to a place where there are enough people who know how to think to staff a university. Am I happy about the fact that there's nothing to be done about the universities in one generation? Absolutely not. I think it's terribly dangerous. Yeah. But I don't want to kid myself or anyone else about how easy a problem it is to solve. And what you're talking about is the same issue. But back to the founders, the solution is to return to those founding values. Mm-hmm. We have to be able to say anything and then to hash out which of these ideas actually stands up to scrutiny without fear. And having bullies tell us that we're not allowed to speak about the possibility that the climate crisis isn't what we think it is or that it doesn't exist at all. No, nobody's entitled to tell you can't think those thoughts.
Yes.
So
I love the definition of freedom of speech that I really appreciate is the purpose of freedom of speech is so that our ideas can go to battle and die so that our bodies don't have to.
That's beautiful.
Right? It's like it's the alternative to physical force, right? Yep. A very important one.
Yeah, it is the alternative. And we have to now apply these things fearlessly in order to be able to figure out what really is in our interest, where we have to make concessions in order to, for example, protect the oceans or not. Maybe my understanding of the jeopardy to the oceans is incorrect, but
Yeah, that's the other thing, is because a lot of these things get overblown, like the climate hysteria.
Yep.
Right? Because it's in their interest to tell everyone that the world is, we're all going to be dead in 10 years from global warming. So then you get this divergence of truth and narrative.
Yep.
And it's hard to disentangle, right? It's like, I'm sure the plastic island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that's the size of Texas. That's what I've heard.
Yep.
Is that true?
No idea.
Yeah, I have no idea.
No idea. I will say, global warming is a funny one because carbon dioxide is not a toxin. The degree to which it is elevated is small.
Yeah. Yeah. Very small.
The Arrhenius equation, which tells us that it ought to trap heat, I think is pretty secure, but it's embedded in a complex system, which means that there are a lot of feedbacks. I am less and less convinced that this is an emergency. It's certainly not our top emergency. Yeah. I can come up with things that are far more terrifying on shorter time scales.
Yeah.
It is also dependent on hypothetical feedbacks that are untestable by us average folk. The damage to the oceans is different. Ask anybody who has spent their life on the oceans about the density of creatures, about the size of the fish that they pull in, about the mixture of species. And
the bleaching of the reefs and all that.
Well, the bleaching of the reefs turned out to be largely fictional.
Oh, that was fictional. I didn't know that.
Largely.
Okay.
But the diversity of the fish, the size of the fish that are brought in, these things are dropping at a terrifying rate. So anyway, that is something. I don't have the experience. I haven't spent my life on the sea, but I have heard the same story from people who have again and again and again, and I think it's real.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to these things either, but it's always, I go back to just freedom, right? It's like, well, I don't know. You had a good counter to that earlier, though. The whole owning the mountaintop and then having the rights to scalp it and take the...
Right. And we see this, right?
Yeah.
There are...
But we don't have ownership in the oceans.
Right.
We don't have private ownership, at
well,
least.
but so what we have are terrifying factory ships. We have fleets that are at sea apparently for years at a time with populations of virtual slaves who are strip mining the ocean of fish.
Right.
Right? Is that anybody's right? I really don't think so. We don't. And actually, this goes to a point.
That one's so hard.
Our ancestors had a natural incentive to preserve the resources on which they depended. And so there's actually a whole body of scholarship, Eleanor Ostrom, who studied the way cultures preserve a commons. And she found a whole architecture that evolves naturally because it doesn't make sense to destroy your own fishery if that's what you eat. It does not work if you're a conglomerate that has fishing as one of many interests and you can turn fish into money irrespective of the amount of harm you do in the process and then move on to timber, right? Or you're doing all of these things simultaneously. You're stripping them and then, 100 years later, you'll be a microchip company. So there's a big difference between a diversified financial entity, which does not have an interest in preserving its resource, and a people or a specialist that has to keep that business sustainable. So anyway, it's not built into us.
Yeah. So common pool resources, is that what she called them? I think. It's tricky. I just don't think we're going to ever argue a solution for this. It's like I would just lean back to experimentation. It's like we need to try different things. But the oceans, that one is particularly difficult because it is the wild, wild west, right?
Yep.
Whatever you can get away with out there, you're going to get away with it. And it's not even really feasible to have law out there, right? I mean, we don't really have, we do sort of, there's maritime law, but it's not. equality in the eyes of the law as we understand it here on land. So it's difficult to have any semblance of a stable economic reality out there.
I don't know. I want to just put a possibility on the table. This might be an argument for a shift to tariffs. Because how do you stop the Chinese from deploying fleets that strip mine the ocean? Maybe you impose a tariff on goods that they want to sell in our markets. And the point is that that's a concentrated pressure, and that all of the nations that share a particular ocean might find that they create a system of effective treaties by recognizing the danger to a resource on which they are dependent and do not have the capacity to protect it independently.
That makes sense. And then, yeah, now we are getting outside of libertarianism a little bit if we're using fiscal solutions to problems like this. And maybe that's okay. I don't know.
I'm not sure we are. The point is, if you imagine that it's not, I guess the problem is libertarianism 1.0 is so focused on the individual that it doesn't scale. But if you recognize that Americans are another kind of individual and that we have a right to preserve oceans on which we depend and to exert pressure, the same way an individual might exert pressure on their neighbor not to pollute the local environment, that we collectively could exert pressure on another nation not to strip mine the ocean.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I want to go back. We were talking about the universities earlier, and I'm wondering what your views on the extent to which technology is going to change the nature of the university. Like, are people still going to be going to college for these 4-year plus degrees? Is the internet changing the entire game of education for good? Like, how do you see, I guess, traditional academia functioning into the digital future?
Well, that's a tough question to answer. I have 2 college-age kids. They are now both doing study abroad. I was not wildly enthusiastic about them going to college because I now view college as such a mixed bag. If you go to college without a good plan for avoiding nonsense, you can very well come out stupider than you went in. And, isn't that mind-blowing? In 2024, college is a place that might make you stupider.
Yeah.
Right? So anyway, that's a problem.
Yes, definitely.
That said, education does not have to be done in a college environment. Historically, it's interesting that research and education have been housed in the same place. And there is a natural relationship, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. What technology does to the entire process is really unclear, and how durable it is. We imagine that technological progress will just simply continue. That is a utopian notion, given the number of unsustainable feedbacks that are involved. And yes, these things do tend to be replaced by something in time to preserve the overall system. But I'm ever more convinced that there's a story of our planet that we don't really know. And that because we have lived in a period in which there has been more or less progress consistently throughout what we call history, we think that's the automatic state of affairs. But it may not be. And I do think people need to have more experience and develop skills relative to the physical world so that if this is a process that actually ebbs and flows, we are not left so vulnerable to the fact that we don't know how to do anything for ourselves.
Yeah, it's a tricky one too. Because, for the past even 10 years, it was all computer programming, right? Everyone just learned how to engineer, learn how to program.
Learn
That's
to
the
code.
way to the future. And now almost overnight, it seems like this AI thing is just like, no, actually don't do that. Don't do that. AI will handle that.
Which I'm not actually convinced of.
I'm not either, but I'm just using it as an illustration of how quickly the perception can change at least. Now the reality, who knows what the reality is, but the conventional wisdom of everyone go program, and now it's like, oh, maybe everyone.
Well, but I think you can extrapolate a little bit. Used to be, the first computers were programmed by physically plugging cables from one port to another. That's a binary system. Mm-hmm. You then have machine language. You then have languages that require a compiler. Then you have languages that don't require a compiler. Now we have LLMs. Who is in a position to instruct an LLM in the building of a program to accomplish an objective? It seems to me that a programmer who understands what it is that the LLM has to do is in a much better position to get the LLM to do it and to know if it has been done than somebody who doesn't have that experience. So I'm wondering if there's not a retooling that would be reminiscent of one of these prior jumps where people who really understand the process that, from the era they've just emerged from are in the best position to guide the next phase.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we've come all the way back to the reciprocal reconstruction thing at the beginning of the conversation. It's just but the reality is changing so fast. I'm reminded of this E.O. Wilson quote. He says something like, the problem with human beings is we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, godlike technologies. And the technologies are just changing so quickly now. Well, we're having institutional disruption, or at least distrust, right? That things are coming to light now in the new media paradigm of the internet and social media that had not been in the light for many decades previous. And so you have these godlike technologies disrupting the medieval institutions, stirring up all these Paleolithic emotions.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong? And so, and you said, as you said earlier, right, like radical change. Well, evolution doesn't do that, right? Evolution's incremental change typically, but there is the punctuated equilibrium sometimes, right, where it changes rapidly.
Not a huge fan of punctuated equilibrium as a model, but there is something to it. Evolution does not have a constant rate. But I would point out, even if you take the idea that evolution does not generally engage in radical change, we are the products of evolution, and we do engage in radical change. So, I sometimes... You'll hear evolutionists claim that evolution cannot look forward. It can only look backward.
Right.
That's true in a sense, but it's also false, right? And you can tell it's false because...
Is that the same argument that it's not teleological? It's not purpose-driven?
Yeah, but I guess I can do the two of them at once. Okay. You can look forward, right?
I think so.
Let's say you give your children guidance based on the world you expect them to live in. That guidance may be poor, it may be great, but you are definitely looking forward for the purpose of properly arming your kids for the world they're going to live in. So you can look forward. Evolution built you to do that. So in what way can evolution not look forward? If it can build a mechanism to look forward, it can look forward, right? Likewise, purpose. I have long argued that all evolved creatures have the identical purpose from each other, all of them. And that means it's a pretty terrible purpose.
Get into the future?
Yeah, get into the future as far as you can, by whatever means necessary. And that will include things like, putting people in gas chambers, right? Do you want to be downstream of a process that will cause you to put people into a gas chamber because that's how your genes are going to end up in the future?
Was that really...
Sure.
Did that help? Did that, you're extinguishing another competing strategy, basically.
Hey, shocking, right? So my feeling is I don't want any part of a program that might have me manning a gas chamber. Right. Even if that's evolutionarily the right thing to do, I am out.
Right.
I am not a robot who is going to enact such a program. So my point is, if you have the same purpose as malaria, get into the future. But you have been equipped to get into the future with a value system, an ability to conjure realities that haven't existed, right? If you've been given all of the architecture of compassion and beauty and insight, if all of those are tools, means to an end, to get into the future, you are also capable of supplanting that evolutionary objective, that program, and deciding on a better one. In other words, this is the moment at which the tools that we have been awarded have to stage a revolution against the mindless program that has us doing whatever's necessary to get into the future. And ironically, that is how we're going to get into the future. Either that or we're going to fail and go extinct.
Right. No, it's well said. That I forgot the name of the book, but talked about how evolution basically explores the search space immediately around it, right?
The adjacent possible.
But you typically can't see as far into the future as the thinking, innovative, purpose-driven animal can. And so we can enhance our own evolution. I guess that's higher risk, higher reward. We could also go the wrong way, right?
Yeah,
we could take
that is what we're doing. And that's why we have these tools.
Right. So
we are better at this because we can imagine what might be possible and then explore in a reasoned way.
Yes. So then imagination becomes basically our superpower.
Yep.
Before starting the What is Money show, I spent most of my career as a CFO, overseeing internal technology implementations and business acquisitions. Over the next 10 years, it is projected that over 12 million businesses in the U.S. will be sold. If you are an operator running a business generating between $5 and $200 million of revenue, and you're considering selling your business within the next decade, then there is a significant opportunity for you to deploy technology to streamline business processes, reduce operating costs, and enhance the multiple your business ultimately sells for. To this end, I am partnering with the team at Emerge Dynamics, a firm with decades of experience in maximizing the value of privately held, small and middle market businesses. Go to emergedynamics.com/breedlove to learn how you can build an attractive, high multiple company that maximizes your return when you fully exit. Again, that's emergedynamics.com/breedlove. This December 17th to 21st, 2024, join me on the Pacific coast of Mexico for our men's retreat, The Art of Alpha. At this world-class retreat center, we will have daily meditations, movement practices, yoga, cold plunging, infrared sauna, and many other biohacking modalities, all while enjoying world-class cuisine designed for optimal full-body health. The retreat center is a gorgeous biohacker's paradise located right on the ocean. You can think of this place as a nervous system reset facility. At the Art of Alpha, we are seeking men who wish to cultivate freedom, wisdom, sovereignty, physical fitness, truth, and love in themselves and in those who look up to them. If you've always felt motivated to push yourself to new limits to discover the best version of yourself, but you've struggled to find the right community to immerse yourself in, then the Art of Alpha is for you. To apply to join the Art of Alpha, go to breedloveevents.com. Again, that's breedloveevents.com to apply to join us for the Art of Alpha on the Pacific coast of Mexico this December 17th through 21st, 2024. I want to ask you about Dawkins and Peterson because I know just their contrasting views. Like we're obviously getting into the philosophical depths here. On one hand, you've got Richard Dawkins, the infamous rational atheist, author of The Selfish Gene and many other. Actually, I talked to him on the show. His book, River Out of Eden, is one of my favorite biology books. He describes evolution, actually, as a river of genetic information flowing across time, which I thought was a beautiful metaphor in the way, anyways. And then so that's one like very materialistic, non-religious, irreligious, even hardcore Darwinian view of reality. And then contrasting that as this Jungian psychology, psychedelic Peterson view, where there's a lot more, he would say it's not just about matter, but what matters, things like this, that the domain of significance and symbolism, et cetera. What are your views? And these are both very popular gentlemen.
Yep.
On the intellectual dark web, where you yourself are very popular. What are your views on the spectrum between these two thinkers?
Well, there is a tragedy in motion, right? These guys need to have a meeting of the minds. I am a huge fan of Dawkins. I've learned so much from reading his books. He is not much a fan of mine, I will say. In fact, Peterson suggested that I should moderate their discussion, and Dawkins would have none of it, which is a terrible thing, because I understand both of their perspectives quite well, and there's a watershed moment waiting to happen if Dawkins can hear Peterson. Dawkins has a block. In The Selfish Gene, Dawkins, in chapter 11, introduces the concept of the meme. This is the on-ramp to understanding human beings, because there is something very special about us at the level of cultural evolution. And so chapter 11 is a very important moment scientifically, because it opens the door to us understanding ourselves. But Dawkins himself makes an error, which is, something we all do, and has failed to correct it to this day. So that was 1976 that he published it. The error comes in the form of his claim that memes exist in a new primeval soup. That's his phrase, a new primeval soup. So he imagines that we have genetic evolution, and then genetic evolution has somehow given rise to this whole new landscape where new kinds of creatures can evolve. This is not right.
Oh, so he doesn't see the continuum between biological and cultural.
Right.
Okay.
Cultural evolution is the gene's solution to a gene problem, right? Culture works better because it evolves faster.
Yeah.
So genes have solved a limitation on their own rate of evolution and their own rate of adaptation by offloading the adaptive work to the cultural layer.
Right.
Now, the problem for Dawkins is that once you spot that the meme layer is not some new primeval soup, it's actually some hyper-sophisticated layer in which what it means to be a human being is being altered without changing genes. We are adapting without evolving at a genetic level. We are evolving culturally without our genes having to be involved in the change. Well, then you realize something. That when we look at the structures that we find that are the product of cultural evolution, they are not new creatures. They are features of the animal in question. So when we look at a religion, which is really the place that I think Dawkins is blocked, when we look at a religion, we are looking at a structure that ought to have the same meaning to an evolutionary biologist as an eye or a leaf or a hair follicle.
I see.
Right? It's an adaptation.
Yeah. Right.
And that drives a guy like Dawkins crazy.
Right.
Because I think as a very young man, he realized there's no being in the sky. And that realization has blocked him from further realizations, which are those who have this belief in the being in the sky apparently have an advantage over the people who know that there isn't one. How does that work exactly? Why would believing something that isn't true advantageous? Now, as far as Peterson goes, I should say Peterson and I get along incredibly well, which you might think we shouldn't. He's a religious guy and I'm not. But it happens that if I listen to him speak about human beings and what he knows about them from psychology, from his work on symbolism and narrative, I can almost always translate what he says back into my own rigorous scientific language, right? So I find him very compelling, and I actually think history will, if history ever gets written, and I'm not convinced that the present can ever properly be recorded, but if it happens that proper historians go back and try to figure out what happened in the 2020s, let's say,
Yeah.
that they will record Peterson as I would think, Jung's equal at least.
Right.
He is a deeply insightful person, and what he is trying to tell us is incredibly powerful.
And
So
that's saying something.
it really is saying
Jung's
something.
equal. Yeah.
And I really, I will confess, I am disappointed in and frustrated with Dawkins.
Yes.
Because I feel that he is my mentor. He mentored me through his books. And I therefore know a lot about his state of mind when he was a young man.
Sure.
And I believe that as a young man, there are things that he would have been able to recognize that as an old man, he can't see. And the irony, the punchline of the whole story is that if Dawkins were to recognize the error that he is making and begin to hear what it is that people like Peterson and people like me are trying to tell him, that results in his own work being vastly more important than it is if he leaves it as it's currently understood.
Right. That's such a brilliant weaving together of the two thinkers. This was coming up for me. I don't know if this is correct or not. We have genotype and phenotype. Genotype is the instructions, the information.
Yeah.
And phenotype's the physical expression of
Yeah.
that. And you're describing religion maybe as some type of there's the concept of the extended phenotype, right? Where, the blind man's stick is the typical analogy given, right? Where does the blind man's perception really end? Is it in his hand? Well, he gains a new level of perception with the stick. So is it in the tip of the stick? And we feel this when we drive the car, right? You kind of get this broadened proprioception when you're parking, right? You just kind of know where the car is. You're describing religion and social institution maybe as something like that, perhaps?
100%. In fact, Dawkins and I met once and only once in 2018. We had a discussion on stage in Chicago. And I think he was caught off guard. He didn't really, he thought it was going to be a standard interview. And it ended up, I wanted it to be a discussion between colleagues. And I thought the disagreement between us was productive. And of course, in the end, I thought that disagreement actually offered something to Dawkins that he would benefit from recognizing, but he didn't see it that way. But anyway, in that conversation, which was only partially recorded, I don't know if this part's in there, but I said to him, as we were talking about religion and our different views on how it interfaces with evolution, I said to him, it's extended phenotype, which caught him off guard because, of course, extended phenotype is also his concept. And it's the one
that's his concept.
That's his concept.
Holy shit,
and
I didn't know that.
It's actually the concept that he considers his most important contribution.
Wow.
So that's the fascinating thing about this is if you take, let's say, his two most important
He didn't extend it far
contributions,
enough.
he doesn't see the connection. And it's an absolute revolution when you see it.
Wow.
Right? What a human being is
Yes.
just is instantly transformed when you
Yes.
understand that our genome has built a layer that solves a problem the genome cannot solve on its
Yes.
own because it's too slow to evolve.
Yes.
Which explains why a human being, unlike every other species you could name, does not have a niche.
Right. We create our own niches, right?
We can have 100 niches
Yes.
because the point is you can swap out the software
Right.
program.
Right.
Right? That's an amazing creature.
Yes.
That's why my advisor called us the uniquely unique species.
Right,
Because
right.
we have this capacity to take this generalist robot platform and swap in a new software package, and you
Yes.
could be a totally different creature.
Yeah. Our hyper adaptability is our superpower, right?
It is our
both in terms of
superpower.
neuroplasticity and then obviously opposable thumb and the way, yeah.
Yep.
That's amazing. So what if it was framed in the sense of tools, then, right? That the phenotype, like literally is, your hand is a tool, basically a multi-purpose tool. Religion, mythology, narrative. This is probably, honestly, like the way and this is largely influenced by Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning, and all the bibliography to that book, which takes you down a bunch of rabbit holes. But it seems like the development of language itself, natural language, is bound up with the emergence of religion and mythology, right? It's like the original
Totally.
social institution, and then it's around, well, these are people of the book, right? Oftentimes, at least when we're talking about Judeo-Christian mythology, right? There's people of the book. So would that be a more useful framing? It's like, look, man, if you consider the hand to be a technology, and obviously we're blurring the line now, right? Because it's biology, it's not technology, but it's a tool that changes over time. The same genes that give rise to that expression give rise to another layer, you're saying, another tool layer that makes different trade-offs, right? It can adapt more quickly, but it's also probably more prone to error, right? I guess cultural layer could fail, and the evolutionary layer would be more robust to error. Is that correct?
Once you see it, it's actually pretty straightforward. Mm-hmm. The mimetic layer, the cultural layer, mm-hmm. has a very high error rate, mm-hmm. and the products of that error go extinct at a high rate too. Mm-hmm. So it's a much more experimental layer,
yes. Yeah.
but it is still a question of signal to noise. So my claim would be you cannot know that something cultural and new mm-hmm. is good for the creature doing it, mm-hmm. right? Is it good for us to be putting together cute dance routines on TikTok? Probably not.
Right.
The fact that people are doing it doesn't tell you anything. But if they do it for 1,000 years, if a population of a small number of people innovate it, and then 1,000 years from now, it's millions of people, then you'll be able to say, okay, that is good. In what way? Now we can ask the question, in what way?
Right.
So the point is, if I found something that sounds like a religion and I gather a bunch of people together, mm-hmm. To talk about it and think about it once mm-hmm. a week, is it adaptive? No, we don't know. But if we look at Catholicism or Judaism mm-hmm. or Islam or Hinduism, mm-hmm. any of these traditions that go back hundreds or thousands of years, right, that involve a huge amount of expense for the people who believe mm-hmm. them. Not just expense in terms of building monuments and spending their time, mm-hmm. but all of these structures forbid people from doing things that would enhance their fitness in a narrow sense.
But expanded in a broad sense.
Right.
Yes.
So that's the point.
Yeah.
These are the ancient solutions to these game theoretic problems, right?
That's it.
Why should you not cheat on your wife?
Right.
Well, there are very good reasons not to cheat on your wife. They might be a little hard to explain, but if you think there's somebody in the sky watching who you can't escape their view.
It's a very energy efficient way to propagate the meme.
If you believe in it, then the point is actually there's no escaping the consequence of this. I'm going to pay, lake of fire is a very powerful incentive. It doesn't matter that there's not a literal lake of fire.
Right.
If I believe that I'm going to end up in a lake of fire, it's going to get me to think very carefully about the behaviors that put me in that danger.
Yes. The Thomas theorem says something like, if a man acts as if a thing is real, then it is real, basically.
It is real in a sense, and this is exactly the sort of thing where Peterson shines.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Peterson's example of numbers here comes to mind, right? It's like, well, what are numbers? Are they real? Like, not really. They're not here. Like, where's 3? But it's hyper real in a way that you can use numbers to categorize almost anything in the discernible universe, basically.
Right. Now, check this out, though. My claim, and I have no doubt that this will get Dawkins' knickers even further in a twist, but my claim is that there is a process by which our early understanding of virtually anything is more metaphorical than it is literal.
100%. It's all metaphor.
It's all metaphor.
Yeah.
But even in science, even in cellular
mathematics
biology.
is metaphorical.
Right.
Yeah.
But take cellular biology. We aim to understand how the structures, how the molecules in the cell function to produce the phenomenology that we see. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we've got it nailed to a fairly well, right? We have a really good idea about at least the first order of how DNA stores information that becomes hereditary. Mm-hmm. Darwin didn't know where the hereditary information was.
Yeah.
But the point is now we know, and we know what code it's in. And
Yes.
so that's a fantastic, very literal kind of description. But a lot of what we say about what goes on in cells or organs is not. It's sort of a placeholder for things that we know here and we know there, and we can't exactly explain how they're connected. So we come up with some story that's approximate and good enough, and that if you think it's true, it allows you to do the work, right?
Yeah.
But think about something like malaria. Malaria is named for the original misconception of what it was that made people sick.
Oh, really?
Bad air,
Oh.
right? Swampy air.
Oh, malaria.
Malaria.
Makes sense.
Right. Now, if you avoid swampy air, you get less of this illness. Why? Because
Less
the swampy place has the mosquitoes. So the point is it wrong? Well, it's not exactly wrong. It's just so...
It's a heuristic.
It's a heuristic that allows you to avoid the disease. And the point is, we can laugh about it now, but...
Well, those are codified in religion too, though, right?
100%.
Don't eat the pork. Don't eat the shellfish. Whatever.
100%.
Yeah.
And so then this is the place where I would come back at Peterson, because you've got all of these kosher laws. We can reverse engineer what those kosher laws were actually protecting people from, for the most part. They are completely out of date, right? These are not, you do not need to worry about trichinosis, right? Trichinosis is not an issue, so pork is back on the menu.
Yeah.
But we need a whole new set of kosher laws, because there's a lot of stuff you shouldn't be eating. Like, where's the, the warning of, seed oils.
Yeah,
right?
seed oils.
Yeah, somebody's going to come up with an industrial lubricant and then figure out how to sell it to you as food, and you should ignore them and not eat it.
We need some kosher law against that for sure.
We need new kosher, right? So
it's an adaptive mechanism.
It's an adaptive mechanism, and as much as I love Peterson's perspective, and this would be easy, and I have said this to Peterson, the problem is the ancient wisdom is not up to date for the modern problems. There are elements of it that are timeless. There are elements of it that are probably now wrong.
Yes.
And so somehow you have to go back to that ancient stuff and say, what do we do with the fact that there's no description that tells us what process was unfolding here, what we were being protected from.
Right.
So we're damned if we do. You can't throw it out. You can't just follow it blindly.
Right.
It needs some, an addendum on enriching uranium and seed oils and all of the stuff that never got mentioned.
Yeah.
And that's the modern predicament. What do we do with a world that doesn't look like the one where those traditions evolved?
It needs like software engineering notes, right, where they write the code here, but then on the right, they actually say, "Oh, this is what I was trying to do here. This is the purpose, the intention." Yeah.
We need the comments.
Yes, the comments
to tell what the programmer intended, and they don't exist.
We're in such a good place right now, because this is what I feel like I'm always trying to articulate to people about mythology and religion that I can't quite get across. When people and I used to be this guy, by the way, woo-woo fairy tales bullshit. All that's just fairy tales for adults.
Yep.
Humans don't need it. It's all hardcore, Dawkins-like science. But it's not that. It's this adaptive layer that increases group fitness by prohibiting, individual acts of imposing ethics in a way, not imposing ethics, telling you a story about why ethics will promote group success, and by violating that code, what will happen to you. And this is where I think when you said Dawkins and Peterson sounds like he's correct. Again, drawing on the tradition of Jung, because Jung, the mythology that Jung is drawing from, and who Peterson is in turn drawing from, it's descriptive, right? It's describing this long catalog of evolutionary history that's been encoded in mythology layer by layer. And so it's like this discovery of the human psyche layer by layer. And so when we describe the archetypes or whatever, because I don't want to use the word blueprint because that's for complicated systems, not complex systems, but it's a complex blueprint of us. But it's never final, right? The map is never the territory, and it's ongoing. Life is a process that's ongoing. So you can't just, it's not like you're just, okay, Bible's done, no more to see here. It has to continue on, right? There's more, and indeed that's how the Bible has been created, right? It's layers of books, essentially. that have occurred over time. But to look at it as a technology, I think is just so fascinating, and it throws people for a loop because they're thinking, oh, it's religion versus science. It's like, actually, no, religion is a technology that lowers the cost of interpersonal trust and therefore increases group fitness, something like that.
I think a technology is exactly the way to think about it.
Yeah.
It is a technology, and it's not just the social layer, right? The fact that it does, extend into nutrition, for example,
right.
is an indicator of what sort of compendium of wisdom it is.
Yes.
And, I do think that this is the argument that we need to be having, which is those books are compendiums of wisdom, and they do not have a comment layer. So we've got a precautionary principle and Chesterton's fence issue, which is that we don't know which of these things are still profoundly important and which of them are archaic and can be abandoned. Now, interestingly...
Can we implement that? That seems like a very useful thing.
Let's do it. On the next iteration, it should definitely have a comment layer. But I will tell you, again, as soon as you see what's actually going on in the evolution of these structures, you realize how powerful Dawkins' meme concept is.
Yeah.
Because you've got Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses on the church door. Mm-hmm. Protestantism starts. Mm-hmm. What happens? Well, you get what, if this were a critter, we'd call an adaptive radiation, right? You get a bunch of different Protestant branches, and they disagree about what to emphasize, what to de-emphasize. Likewise, you have the Catholic Church, and then you have the Russian Orthodox and the Church of England, which subscribe to the same doctrine but have abandoned allegiance to the Pope. This sectarian difference of opinion is the substrate on which selection acts, right? You get different groups deciding how much to adhere to, which parts are important, and then they are in de facto competition. And the more accurate your edit is, the better you do, the farther that belief structure spreads. Right. That's how evolution works.
Yes. Oh, this is great. Okay. If you will permit me a parallel here, if religion is this social technology that reduces the cost of interpersonal trust, right? Like if I'm a Christian and you're a Christian, well, then you can like sort of operate. It's less difficult for me to try to determine like what your values are, right? If I go to church with you every Sunday and our families grow up together, and it's like, I know if I turn my back, you're not going to stab me. Like we probably do a business deal together. Like there's a lot of long range cooperation that opens up because we've made trust more attainable or less expensive, let's say. Something like that.
Good.
Okay. So emergent social institution that lowers the cost of interpersonal trust to increase group fitness, if I may use that framing. That also sounds a lot like money to me. That there's an emergent social technology that lowers the cost of trust and increases group fitness.
Okay. Very fertile territory here. I want to correct one thing.
Okay.
Your use of the term group is arguably true but misleading. Okay. The term to use there is lineage.
Okay. Lineage fitness.
Yeah.
Right.
Culture.
Yes. Don't want to be Marxist for sure.
Well, never mind that. Culture is unique from genes because it's passed horizontally.
Yeah.
But most culture is passed vertically.
Right.
And so what people don't understand, in fact, what confuses Dawkins in part, is that because...
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time?
Culture is special. It evolves rapidly because it can move horizontally.
Culture is horizontal, genes are vertical.
But that's wrong.
Oh, that's wrong.
What makes culture special is that it can move horizontally. That's why it can evolve so quickly.
Right.
But most culture is passed vertically.
Oh, most of it's passed vertically. So you're saying from parents to offspring.
Right. Your kids speak language that's very similar to yours. They come to believe things that are very similar to the things that you believe.
Are we getting into Rene Girard's mimetic theory now? Imitation is cultural transmission?
I am not expert enough to say. I'm a fan, but I'm still early in thinking about Girard. But in any case, the point is, because most culture is passed vertically, as a population, that is, these genetically related individuals spreads because its belief system is a good match for the environment, it passes down that culture, which reinforces the spread of these things. And this can be extremely powerful. So, for example, I would argue that the reason that Christianity spread the way it did had a lot to do with the fact that it innovated monogamy as a breeding system. And I would argue that monogamy is the best breeding system for an era of positive sum dynamics. And the reason is because human babies are incredibly expensive to raise. So if you want a population to grow at the maximum rate, you want all adults involved in contributing to the rearing of children. If you have a polygynous system where one guy has a bunch of wives, that sidelines a bunch of men. They have no incentive to contribute to the raising of offspring, so the population grows slower. So for the age of exploration, you want a monogamous population because it's capable of adopting territory at the fastest rate.
Wow.
Okay, so you said something that included a group that threw me a little bit.
Yeah.
Lineage is the right term.
Yeah. So it's religion as a social technology that lowers the cost of interpersonal trust to increase lineage fitness. And then I was drawing that parallel to, it sounds a lot like money in a way.
Yep.
At least the emergent social technology and lowering the cost of trust. I mean, increasing money in a real sense, it would be, I guess, actual group fitness in a way. Like to the extent we're all in one monetary network, it's not just lineage, it's everyone is using it.
All right. So I wanted to respond in a couple of ways. One, think about, let's use Catholicism here as an example, because Catholicism kind of does things over the top so you can see how the structures work. Not only can you know, because you're in the same congregation as some other person, that they're probably trustworthy because you've been in close contact with them, you spent time with them each week, you know a lot about them. But you also have the advantage of a priest who not only is that priest in a position to observe the entire congregation, and that priest forbidden to become wealthy or to have sex with congregants, so he is harder to corrupt because the two major mechanisms of corruption are not available in any way. You know, he has to be very, very careful if he's corrupt in this regard, because the slightest hint that he's on the take or on the make are both bad. Yeah. So the priest has stepped out of the mechanisms of profit. He is a beneficiary of basically a welfare state that funds this priest to do the priest's job. That priest, not only is he in a position to observe all of the people and to learn about their defects, he's watched them grow up, something like this, but he's also hearing their confessions. Now imagine for a second, let's say you have two people in this congregation who are striking up a relationship, a sexual relationship that they shouldn't have. They're betraying their spouses or something like that. Well, each of them is going to worry that the other is going to confess it to the priest. And the last thing you want is for the priest to know that you've engaged in something that you haven't confessed, because that's really bad, right? So, there's an incentive not to get involved in this relationship because the complexity of figuring out, do I have to confess it? Once I have confessed it, what happens, right? So the point is maybe just don't get involved, right? So there's a barrier to a kind of cheating happening there. But let's say that the priest hears from one party that some cheating has happened and doesn't hear from the other party. Well, this priest is now empowered with this book full of all of these terrifying stories. And, every week he's got to deliver a sermon And he's capable of getting up there and delivering a sermon that'll put the fear of God into you, that, God might be aware of what's going on. And now suddenly you're hearing, open your Bible to such and such a, and so the point is that guy who is hard to corrupt because he isn't involved in money or sex, as far as we know, he's in a great position to take any outbreak of cheating of any kind and stamp it out.
Right.
By virtue of accessing this book full of very frightening stories that happens to tap into an architecture that these people who've grown up in the congregation have taken into their being as they've grown up and heard the stories of. So anyway, the point is, it's a beautiful system for somebody who's not involved in the day-to-day economics of the structure to protect the entire lineage.
I see. Because he's outside of the structure, he can be the shepherd of the structure. In a way.
Yes, he can.
That's so fascinating how you tied that all together with game theory. Even it really.
But to your final point, though, money has some of these characteristics, but not others. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I would be particularly cautious about is that money reduces the dimensionality of the system. Mm-hmm. Right? Money is one-dimensional.
Quantity, not quality. Basically.
It's quantity, and it doesn't contain, for some reason, human beings are built to be able to track a bunch of different currencies at once, right? You can be attracted to somebody and afraid at the same time, right? You're tracking two different things, and somehow the sum total of these things will result in you acting or not acting, but still you're tracking a bunch of different currencies at once. Money tends to take all of these things down to a single bottom line, and I think that's part of the problem with it.
I would say it's a trade-off, because that's a huge advantage actually for economic calculation. When you're like, the world's very complicated, and like, I don't need to know that there was an earthquake in Chile that severed the flow of copper into the market. I just need to know the price of copper went up.
Yep.
And I'm incentivized to produce more and consume less, basically, right? So it's data compression.
Yeah.
But you're as you said, you are excluding all the qualitative aspects of everything. And so if you reduce everything to just a number, then it gives you this unidimensional view. But the unidimensional view is necessary to perform economic calculation.
Well, all right. So I agree with you. There's a trade-off here. You're right. It's greatly facilitating, and it is also oversimplifying in some ways. But if you think about when we say, we talk about somebody's net worth. Mm-hmm. When we say net worth, we're talking about dollars or Bitcoins or whatever, right? Which is weird, because we all know that, somebody may be tremendously valuable because they're the life of the party, or because they're deeply insightful, or because, they have an intuition about the future. Yeah. And the point is, but what's their net worth?
There's so much more to human worth than their financial position.
Right. And it's multifactorial. Yes. So it's weird, money does mesmerize us in a way that it probably shouldn't.
That's a great point. This goes to like this is something my friend shared with me that was given to him in therapy, I think. And he was saying that the trying to divorce his identity from his accomplishments. And when he framed it that way, I was like, that's very difficult for me to think about. Like, I think I do invest a lot of my identity into my accomplishments in a way that I don't know I could disentangle those so easily. So the thought experiment was something like, well, if you lost everything, and your everything, all your wealth, all your reputation, you're just a dude, like, what are you? And at that point, like, well, you just take care of those around you, right? Your worth is to be useful to those that you love and are around you, something like that. But it's kind of a weird philosophical thing, because that's bound up in your net worth a little bit.
That's the perfect test case. Yeah, exactly. If you got zeroed out, right, you wouldn't be worthless, right? And for one thing, you just still have all of this wisdom and insight about the path that you took that did allow you to accomplish things.
Yes. But you could imagine how worthless you might feel for a little while.
Sure.
And you'd have to go through some therapy.
Right. On the other hand, it's funny. I had a discussion with Jeffrey Tucker. You know,
Oh,
Jeffrey
yeah, I like
Tucker?
Jeffrey Tucker. He's been on the show, too. Yeah.
Anyway, we have it turns out I think we're maybe the only two people who have like a body of thought on bacon-wrapped dates.
Oh, I love bacon-wrapped dates.
Who doesn't?
Yeah, manchego cheese, blue cheese, and
yeah. So Jeffrey's point about them is that it's effectively cheating because you're just taking the most concentrated, awesome stuff and sticking it together, and how could you miss? My point is, they are, I believe, a profound demonstration of market failure.
Okay.
Because, first of all, you can say it's cheating. On the other hand, it's pretty hard to come up with anything that good, and they didn't always exist.
Yeah.
I don't know at what point they showed up. But here's my point about it. Whoever invented the bacon wrap date contributed more to humanity than almost anybody does in a lifetime. Yet there's certainly people who contribute more, but they've created more joy and something to talk about. Whatever it is, they contributed a lot more than an average person does in a lifetime. Did they retire on it? I'm pretty sure they didn't. Did they make $10,000? Not even really a good car. Probably not. So it's a case where somebody's worth to humanity, it's like a one-hit wonder who it's just a marvelous song or something like that, but it doesn't allow you to buy a house or woo a mate or something like that. So somehow the value encoded in the bacon wrap date did not end up producing wealth in the way that we would like it to if we want more people to find stuff we're not doing that we should be, because it would be great.
That's a good one. And it's something related to the fact that it's just an idea or a recipe, right? It's very simple, basically. It's not like, even though he is the innovator of this recipe, it's an idea that can just basically spread very quickly, right? It's hard to sell. It's hard to market. It's hard to protect that idea.
You can't protect it.
Exactly. You can't protect it, basically. And so, in a way, that's okay, I think, that they didn't get rich on the bacon wrap date, because it's good that the idea spread cheaply. Like, had they monopolized the bacon wrap date, and then we would all had to pay the license fee to eat bacon wrap dates, like that would have been a net negative.
This kind of goes back to the point we were just making, though. I'm okay with the fact that they didn't make a fortune on it because of exactly the point.
Yeah.
I think it's great that bacon wrap dates are something a lot of people get to enjoy rather than just somebody who passes through a particular street corner in a particular town.
Yeah.
But I do think that the person who came up with them was entitled to be rewarded. They should be famous. They should be respected because they contributed more to humanity than most people do.
Yeah.
And we want, every time that happens, we want the right person to get credit, right? We want it to result in them living better in some meaningful way, because that incentivizes more people to do that kind of thing.
Right. And we'd sort of do that. I mean, not for everything, and maybe that's because bacon wrap dates, like, a lot of people just started doing it at some point. I don't know. I don't know the story of bacon wrap dates, but I'm struggling for an example here, but I'm sure we could think of an example where someone has innovated something, the first person that put wheels on luggage or whatever it was, right? Like, I don't know. Do we celebrate that guy or that company? I'm not really sure. I don't know who did it, so I guess not. But
yeah, Eric has a riff on the innovation of the rollerboard, which is what allowed luggage to do this. You probably remember what rolling luggage was like before that innovation.
I actually don't.
It was insane.
Yeah.
Right. Imagine like a classic suitcase on tiny little wheels with a leash. I mean, insane.
Doesn't work.
No. But you're right. It is a good example. I don't know how. I think the person did make money on that one because it is a protectable idea.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, I mean, point well taken, though. Your worth is not your financial success.
Yeah.
Your net worth is not your worth.
Well, actually, it would be great if they were better correlated.
I was going to say, if we can, but there's a little bit, I don't know, there's some gray area there, because, again, you don't want the guy monopolizing the bacon wrap dates. Right? Like, if we wanted to make the guy rich and famous that made the bacon wrap dates, yes, but not so much that he monopolized the idea and we all had to pay the licensing fee to eat them.
Yeah, well, actually, This is funny. This is a perfect analog for the problem with intellectual property in science.
Yeah.
So in science, we don't have intellectual property,
Right.
right? There
Can't patent molecules, right?
or ideas,
Yeah.
right? Which creates a problem because they can't be protected. And that means that very often the wrong person gets credit for an idea because they're so easily stolen, and the amount of power one has in the academy is very different. So a powerful person can steal from people who aren't powerful very easily, and it happens a lot. That said, I do not want to live in a world in which you can protect an idea from other people using it. That is a fundamental violation of the nature of ideas.
Yes.
So what I do want is a system in which we track credit very carefully so that the right person is credited for innovating something that's truly important. And the reason that matters is because if you credit the wrong, there's lots of people who think, why, don't be petty.
Yeah.
What does it matter where the idea came from? And the answer is, if you want the system to evolve in a good direction, the right person has to get credit, which is not always easy because ideas may be a composite of, components from different people. But as best as we can arrange it, for the right person to get credit for the innovation actually allows us to get smarter faster. If the wrong person gets credit because you can't protect an idea, then the system goes to garbage.
Would you take this so far as to make it apply to the attribution of quotes? I found, especially in the internet age, it's become difficult where it's like so-and-so, there's some quote, I'm typically referencing all these quotes, and then you'll say, oh, Ayn Rand said that. And then actually someone on the comments is like, no, it wasn't Ayn Rand. It was so. And then someone's like, no, it wasn't so-and-so, it was so-and-so. And so there's always this sort of argumentation about who said what and what quotes. And it's kind of like the bacon wrap dates example. It's not, these quotes aren't changing maybe giving people as much pleasure as the bacon wrap date, but some of these quotes are really damn good. And it's probably important that we attribute them properly. But I'm asking because I've sort of taken the other camp, actually. I've been like, who cares? Like, it's just the words. Let's just get them out there.
We're in a funny bind there because we're really trying to do two things. If you want the system to evolve in the right direction, then it is important as best we can arrange it to award credit for the quotes to the person who actually originated them. From the point of view of generating a mythology that allows us to move forward productively, it may not be important, right? So there may be all kinds of things that we misattribute, but nonetheless, the story that Einstein said it or Rand said it is good enough for an educated person to pick up the sort of themes that matter and learn how to deploy them.
Got it.
So I fall out on the let's award credit properly, but I guess it's a trade-off between which thing you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, well, that's tricky again, especially in the age of the internet, because things like the quotes, everything just gets melted together, basically. Yep. Quotes, ideas, everything. I have to ask you, because you've been very outspoken about this, and rightfully so as far as I'm concerned, but public health, pandemic response, the specter of vaccine mandates that the world was under just 2-3 years ago now, I guess. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with the idea? We already touched on informed consent earlier, so obviously it's a violation of that. But how deep, dark, and bad is the idea of mandating people to do something that's against their bodily autonomy?
COVID radicalized me on this front. I was already very much in favor of the idea of informed consent. I did think initially that masks were a reasonable countermeasure. I changed my position there. I came to believe they were not effective. I was not in favor of mandating masks, but I was an advocate for people deciding to mask themselves until I understood that the evidence did not support that. I was not in favor of vaccine mandates. I was fooled by the evidence that we were given or that was alluded to that suggested that they were effective in preventing COVID and that was worth doing, but I was alarmed by the claim that they were safe, which couldn't possibly have been true. In any case, the entire spectrum of remedies revealed a number of things, and I can't unsee it. I won't unsee it. Public health has been hijacked. Public health is a discipline that provides an irresistible loophole to authoritarians. The loophole is that public health creates a justification for lying about remedies, right? And much of what took place during COVID was a matter of people deciding that they were entitled to mislead us in order to achieve a better outcome than we could achieve by telling us the truth. In the end, the amount of harm that was done by these liars was incalculable. So, I am now suspicious of the entire discipline of public health, because it's not that this was one error, it was many errors. And it's many errors that the discipline of public health has not woken up to even still. Right? Where are the faculties of all of the public health departments who are demanding a full reckoning for what took place during COVID so that their field is not embarrassed again the next time in the same way? It doesn't exist, right? They're a tiny handful of people.
Is that fear? Is that fear?
No, these people are experts in the same sense as all of the other experts. Most of them are phonies. They don't know what they're doing. They're basically well-intentioned, but they're not insightful, and they're behaving like robots, and they've been taken advantage of, and they're now covering their asses. And frankly, my feeling is public health, in theory, has an important role to play, but it is entitled to only one tool. It can persuade us. That's it. It does not get to mandate us, because its belief that it is entitled to lie about the risks that we are facing or the benefits of a particular remedy are just not matched by the hazard that it will be taken advantage of again and used to sell us stuff that's actually unconscionable. In any case, my feeling is informed consent is an absolute right. I don't care how fancy your argument is about the people who are put in danger. In this case, what we ended up doing, we as a civilization, was we ended up putting young, healthy people at absolutely unacceptable risk for the theoretical benefit of protecting old, infirm people, and no reasonable society does that.
Right. Whew, yeah. And isn't this something this is a lesson of history we have already learned in things like the Nuremberg trials, for instance?
We literally hanged 7 doctors at the end of World War II over violations of informed consent.
Yeah.
So this is something that we know and must remember. And I don't know how we have become so comfortable. You know, when we hung those doctors after World War II, informed consent had not yet been codified. It was understood by those who tried this case to be so obvious that we had the right to informed consent that doctors should have understood what they were violating. Right? We literally hanged them over this. And this now extends far beyond medicine. I believe this is also the central principle with respect to our food system.
Yeah.
We have the right to know what's in our food, and we have the right to say, no, I don't want that. And it's not up to us to explain why we think it's dangerous. The answer is, I don't trust that thing's any good. I don't want to put it in my body.
Yeah. I completely agree, and I would like to see us extended even to our financial system, right? As I said earlier about fiat currencies, like this shit should come with a warning label, right? Like the warning label that's on cigarettes, may cause you early death or may adversely impact your health. It's like, well, this may adversely impact your wealth.
Right.
It's okay, maybe not as serious. It's not life or death, but I mean, for some people, it can be life or death, right?
Yep. Well, I mean, I think it is life or death, right? To the extent that somebody is printing money and stealing from you in so doing, of course they are going to take people across a threshold of tolerable finances into finances that are hopeless. That's going to result in people killing themselves, for example.
Yeah, and also can be used to fund a lot of death and all the, World War I, World War II, War on Terror, all these things are just like, mRNA technology.
Yep.
This is a very hot button issue during the pandemic. What is it and what are the problems with it?
Yeah, I have a hard time explaining. To me, the problem is so transparently obvious. It took me a while to realize it, but once I realized it, the problem is so transparently obvious that I would love to be able to explain it simply. I will do my best. I think it's the kind of thing that for a layperson, you might have to hear it a couple times.
Okay.
The mRNA platform solves a problem. It is a gene therapy technology, and it allows you to deliver an mRNA message. mRNA means messenger RNA. Usually messenger RNA is produced in the nucleus of your cells. It moves to the cytoplasm, and then something called a ribosome translates it into protein. Protein does the work of the cell. It creates most of the structures of the cell. So what they innovated was a mechanism for getting RNA messages that they controlled, that they dictated, into cells so that your cells would produce a vaccine-like substance. So instead of a vaccine factory, they had a factory that produces a injectable that turns your cell into a factory.
Sounds like a terrible fucking idea.
It's a terrible fucking idea.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a brilliant idea at one level.
Sure.
Not ready to be injected into a human being.
Yeah.
And frankly, there is a fundamental flaw in it that cannot be solved with present technology. This is where the rubber meets the road. When you get sick with a virus, that virus hijacks your cells. Your cells are covered in protein that you yourself produce. By a complex process in utero, your immune system learns to ignore every protein that you yourself make. So the way immunity works is you learn to ignore your own proteins, and then anytime you see something that you don't recognize, you fight it as a pathogen. When a virus invades your cells, it hijacks them, and they produce more virus. As they do that, they produce proteins that your immune system does not recognize. So your immune system has a capacity to surveil all your cells, and when it encounters a cell that is putting out proteins that you yourself make, but also proteins it doesn't recognize, it regards those cells as virally infected, and it destroys them. Because no matter how important the cell in question is, there's no way to get the virus out of it. So killing it is a better plan than leaving it in place. Okay. So now these folks who made the mRNA vaccines inject them into people, and they tell us that the vaccine will stay in the deltoid. Well, no, it's not going to stay in the deltoid. You're injecting a fluid into a space that doesn't have room for it. It's going to leak out, and in many cases, the needle itself will just by accident have landed in a vein, and that injection will actually go in a concentrated way into the bloodstream. There's no targeting mechanism at all on the lipid nanoparticles, the fats that are used to transport these mRNA messages into the body. You may remember from chemistry that like dissolves like. So fats are what these mRNAs are coated in. Every cell in your body has a fat layer on the outside. Those fats join, the mRNA message goes into the cell starts producing this foreign protein. Your immune system sees that foreign protein. This is actually part of the design. Your immune system is supposed to see it. That's where the immunity is supposed to come from. But your immune system, in recognizing these foreign proteins on your own cells, will assume they are virally infected, and it will destroy them. If that happens in your deltoid, not a huge deal. If it happens in your liver, probably not a huge deal. If it happens in your heart, it's a huge deal, especially if you got a big concentrated glob of it. So a bunch of cells in your heart were producing these foreign proteins and got attacked by your immune system. Because your heart, A, is very well protected, so it doesn't usually suffer from insults. B, it has very low capacity for repair. In fact, mostly it doesn't repair. It scars. So if you got a concentrated dose of this in your heart and a bunch of your heart cells got transfected, your immune system will kill those cells. That leaves you with a wound. It's a wound you don't even know you have because your heart is not innervated for you to be able to feel that damage, right? There's no benefit to it because such damage would be very unusual. So you've got a damaged heart. It's never going to be the same. At best, months will pass and it will scar over. But at worst, maybe you're on the soccer field and you're going to score the big goal and your blood pressure goes up to a level it hasn't been in months, and that wound does arbitrary things. Maybe you collapse. Wow. So the punchline to this story is none of those things have anything to do with the content of the message that was encoded into these things. That just has to do with the platform. The platform has this defect built into it, and any disease you attempted to remedy with this mechanism would cause the same problem. So that's a dire failure. I would also point out there are many other flaws with this technology. The way the mRNA molecules were stabilized was irresponsible. It made for a process that cannot be terminated and is not naturally terminated by biological pathways. It also caused the ribosomes to incorrectly translate into protein so that you get arbitrary products that have arbitrary consequences. The manufacturing of these injectables was piss poor. The quality control was garbage. So there are all kinds of impurities, contaminants, including DNA from SV40, which has potentially cancer-inducing properties. So these shots were an absolute horror show. Design failure after design failure, manufacturing flaw after manufacturing flaw. And the idea that anybody injected healthy people with them is remarkable and needs to be explained.
Is this why we were seeing so much of the heart issues in mostly young men?
Yep.
And the SV40 thing too. So all of this, I mean, it sounds like you are attributing it to, gross negligence at least, but is there any intentionality in any of this in your estimation?
Let's put it this way. That possibility is on the table. We do not really know what was being attempted. But let's assume that the best is true. The best would involve people really not knowing what they had done, which is inconsistent really with the fraud in the trials that is clearly evident. The fraud in the trials, both of efficacy and safety. But at the point that it does finally become clear what the consequence of injecting healthy people with these things is, that it provides almost no benefit with respect to preventing meaningful disease, and that it carries terrible risks at an unacceptable rate, continuing to inject people with them is not just negligence. It's depraved indifference, which is a kind of murder.
Yeah.
And I believe that that's where we are. The fact that we are actually still injecting 6-month-olds with this stuff, for what earthly reason?
It's just become the new flu vaccine, right? I mean, is it, they just sort of, that's what it seems like. I don't get any of this stuff, so I don't know, but it seems like it's been normalized to that extent.
It has, but I'm struggling for words to describe how diabolical it is to inject healthy children with this shot. Children do not suffer from COVID substantially.
Right.
This shot has unknown consequences and known consequences. Almost all of it is bad. A tiny benefit in resisting bad outcomes to a disease that doesn't have bad outcomes for healthy young people is not a meaningful benefit. Putting them at risk of damaging their hearts, putting them at risk of being unable to generate a proper immune response to COVID-like diseases going forward. We don't know that this provides any net benefit at all over a lifetime. It may, in fact, get in the road of developing immunity to this disease that people are now going to be encountering again and again. So all I will say is I believe that any claim that this was merely a terrifying lapse of judgment, an accident that happened in an emergency, that defense is destroyed by the observation that they are continuing to inject this stuff.
Right.
All right. This is people being completely comfortable with causing the deaths of other people's children.
It's fucking horrifying and disgusting, and I can't believe it. I can't. Yeah. Still blows my mind how many people were just are utterly hypnotized by this. Like, we were talking to someone recently, I won't disclose who, but they were just, oh no, the whole family's vaccinated. We get our boosters. We did it. I was just like, holy shit.
It's
crazy. It's a very bright line for me in a way. I'm just like, oh, I don't think I'll ever get along with this person, or
right.
I just can't. I mean, I can't connect with you on that level.
Right.
So, I mean, the big, scary World Health Organization is is involved in stuff like this. You've been pretty outspoken about these organizations. What can we do to reduce the power of these organizations and the power, the influence, everything that they're doing to create a world in which we're injecting children with this poison? How do we curtail the power of these organizations to do that?
I would say, first of all, you need to understand that these organizations are not what they appear to be. The World Health Organization is largely a effectively private trade organization for pharma. It is fueled with pharma money, and it has behaved in an utterly indefensible way. And my feeling is we need to be compassionate and show mercy and be very careful when we're dealing with people. I don't feel that way about organizations. The World Health Organization should be disbanded, and we should get to the bottom of how exactly it found itself in the role that it played during COVID. I will also point out that in this last year, the World Health Organization attempted to pass a pandemic preparedness treaty and modifications to the international health regulations that would have granted it the power to override our national sovereignty, mandate drugs, mandate gene therapies, to mandate the censoring of citizens, a terrifying set of powers that should not be in the hands of anyone.
This was World Health Organization to override like U.S. national sovereignty?
Yep. And the U.S. was pushing this. The U.S. wanted to be overridden. This was a mechanism for escaping our constitutional protections. Now, enough of us caught on to what was going on that we were able to largely derail it. We broadcast the message to our audiences. We then held a protest in Geneva. And although the documents were ultimately passed, they were almost completely defanged at the point they did it. So they saved face, but we dodged almost all of the bullets that they had put in the chamber.
Wow.
However, those same measures are now being advocated at the UN. So I would argue that Donald Trump, A, deserves tremendous credit for having pulled us out of the World Health Organization when he was president, and that if the only thing that he did in office was to pull us out of the World Health Organization, that he would have done us a major service. So that argument is in and of itself sufficient to justify a vote for him in this election, I believe.
I'll finish on this and we can go have a nice steak dinner.
Great.
So I'll try to, hopefully we can make it a bit of a high note, but I don't know if it's going to be a high note or not because it's kind of a dark question. What you just said seems to fit very nicely into this broader theme that many people have been detecting, that there is an ideological assault on the U.S. Constitution and an attempt to replace it with some UN treaty of some kind. It's as if the U.S. Constitution is like the last well, the freedom of speech and all these other, inalienable rights that we have very tightly codified is inhibitory to the aims of one world government, right? It's like the last Alamo they need to conquer, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And that what you just said seemed to fit in really nicely with that. What are your thoughts about that? Is that what's going on here? I mean, and if so, what are we supposed to do as Americans?
You are not imagining it, my friend. And in fact, the way to understand what's taking place is to think about the Five Eyes Alliance. So the Five Eyes Alliance, off the top of my head, it's the U.S., Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, I believe. And what these folks have done is effectively pooled their intelligence assets because our Constitution does not protect us from foreign governments. It's built to protect us from our own government. So our own government is now involved in a kind of trade where we each agree to violate the rights of each other's citizens and then hand over the product. So that is obviously a profound violation of the spirit of the Constitution, but exists outside the previously adjudicated bounds of the letter. So yes, there is a conspiracy more or less out in the open. It has a name, the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes Alliance is dedicated to violating the rights of citizens of the five nations in question. The fact that other international organizations like the UN are being brought in to this fight is very frightening, and it plays into a blind spot. I don't know about you, but I've always understood that the UN was a ineffectual and disappointing organization that I didn't need to think terribly much about because it's just not very powerful.
Yeah.
Just like the World Health Organization, that allows it to engage in things that you don't anticipate, that have consequences that you won't understand until after it's too late. So we almost missed understanding what the WHO was up to. Most people are unaware of what the UN is up to. And I would say enough is enough. We actually need somebody who is sufficiently bold and patriotic to pull us out of these organizations. And if we're going to have international organizations, they need to be properly constructed from the ground up with these protections built as their core element. We cannot turn over our sovereignty to these nebulous organizations that do not have our well-being at heart.
So
that was not as sunny and bright as you were hoping the answer might be.
It's all good. But we do still live under the U.S. Constitution, sort of, in the U.S. So, like, we're just fighting for that. Or, again, going back to the vision of the Founding Fathers is, like, sort of the direction we need to take this thing. But as you said, though, that actually did not... The vision of the Founding Fathers did not include the Five Eyes, I guess.
Right.
So we actually need to take the vision of the Founding Fathers and update it.
We need to update it.
For, just like we said earlier about religion, these like updates, we need to update the spirit of the U.S. Constitution and put some new letter to it to protect us against these.
Yes, it's a brilliant document, our Constitution, and it has done very well. But the loopholers have figured out how to get around it now. And I would point out this isn't just a question of, using international organizations to violate national sovereignty. We've already seen the Constitution effectively destroyed, but we don't detect it because what happened is that our constitutional rights were demoted to privileges, but they are still in force for most people. And so I'm referring to what took place after 9/11, the Patriot Act plus the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, which grants the executive branch the right to declare people terrorists. And once you are declared a terrorist, then the executive branch has effectively carte blanche to do it what it will. You don't have the right to even know that you've been declared a terrorist, no right to have a court review the evidence, or you're not allowed to see it, cross-examine witnesses. All your constitutional rights evaporate if the executive branch on its own authority decides you're guilty of terrorism. And the problem is that we who hear that tend to think, well, what are the chances anyone's ever going to accuse me of terrorism?
They were calling us YouTubers terrorists recently.
There you go.
Yeah.
And people
Literally.
did not understand it. Dis, and malinformation were declared by the Department of Homeland Security to be forms of terrorism. Misinformation being errors,
Right.
disinformation being intentional errors, lies, and malinformation being things that were based in truth that caused you to distrust your government. Terrorism, really? I know.
Malinformation.
Yeah.
So malinformation is truth that causes you to distrust your government,
Right.
and they can label you as a terrorist for speaking that truth.
Absolutely.
Holy
And
fuck.
then you have no rights whatsoever because you're a terrorist, which is not just a word, it's a magic legal term following the NDAA of 2012. So in any case, the Constitution has the right themes. It was a brilliant document. It's not up to the challenge of protecting us from the kinds of forces that we're up against. And the key challenge at this moment is to figure out how to update without destroying it, without, breaking the fundamental rights and obligations that it attempts to encode. And I truly hope that Trump is elected and that he recognizes his opportunity and the challenges to his success and takes that job very seriously.
I want to say I agree, but then that makes me a Trump supporter. I don't know. It's like I don't know. I just don't get political about these things. But if everything you're saying is true, I do agree. And I guess the only thing I would add is that if Trump is elected, I hope he follows through on what he said about Bitcoin at the Nashville conference where I saw him speak, is that he wants to push this thing forward, because I actually think the Bitcoin could be more American in spirit than the U.S. Constitution, actually. Or it's at least maybe equally in spirit, but written in a way that's harder to break. And we need all the help we can get, it sounds like, from these 3-letter agencies and 5 eyes, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Amen to that.
And with that, I guess we'll see in 5 days.
All right, yeah.
If he gets elected or not. This will come out after the election, so you guys know we don't. But Brett, this has been a lot of fun, man.
Yeah, it sure has.
Thank you for doing this, and let's go have some steak.
All right, let's do it.
All right. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.